Tonight, the air is thick with the faint chill of early winter, and the glow of the gas lamps stretches long and uncertain across cobbled streets slick with mist. The year is somewhere between the turn of centuries, when the pulse of Victorian England beats quietly beneath its polished veneer of progress and its hidden fascination with the unseen. The night is Halloween, a night when science and superstition walk side by side, each pretending not to see the other. A night when curiosity trembles on the edge of fear, and the line between the living and the dead grows soft enough to hear a whisper through. Before we step into that narrow space between reason and belief, take a breath. Adjust your chair. Let the quiet around you settle. Whether you are listening from a distant city or from a quiet room where the lights burn low, let the hum of this story surround you. Perhaps you hear the faint ticking of a clock. Perhaps the wind touches the window glass. Wherever you are, the hour bends towards stillness, and this is where we begin. Press like if these journeys through forgotten hours keep you company. Subscribe if you wish to wander further into history's dim-lit rooms. Your presence matters here. Now let the lamps burn low. Let the street grow quiet, and follow me back to a night in Victorian England, when the veil was thin and curiosity was not so far from devotion. London settles beneath its fog like a secret wrapped in lace. The gas lamps hiss softly, their halos trembling in the mist that drifts between narrow alleys and wide boulevards alike. The city never truly sleeps, not even on All Hallows' Eve. Yet there is something different in the rhythm of its breath tonight. The carriages roll slower, their wheels muffled by damp cobblestones. The horses snort, uneasy, as though the air carries more than smoke. At the edge of the street, a vendor packs away the last of his roasted chestnuts, glancing now and then into the gloom. His lantern swings gently from a hook, the small flame inside bending and straightening, like it too is listening. Farther down the street, a paper boy hurries along, his breath visible in the cold. The bundle beneath his arm bears the day's final edition, its ink still faintly damp. The headline boasts of another scientific discovery, a mechanical device that promises to photograph the invisible. He does not stop to read it. The city is full of discoveries and promises. He knows only that tonight, even the cleverest inventions feel small against the dark. The windows of the townhouses gleam with restrained warmth. Behind lace curtains, parlors glow with candlelight, where respectable families gather for evening tea, their silver spoons clinking softly against porcelain. Yet for all their refinement, there is a quiet hum beneath the talk of literature, of trade, of empire. It is the hum of curiosity, the hunger for what lies beyond the reach of the human hand. The Victorians pride themselves on reason, on progress, but in the stillness of a night like this, they listen too closely to the wind. On the other side of the glass, the fog thickens. It curls around the lampposts, swallows the outlines of buildings, and drifts like a living thing across the bridges of the Thames. The river below moves slow and heavy, its surface a dull sheen beneath the moonlight. The bells of St. Paul's strike the hour, their tones softened by distance, resonating through the mist like the heartbeat of the city itself. Somewhere, far across the rooftops, a woman's laughter rises briefly, then disappears into the fog as though drawn away by unseen hands. The smell of coal and rain hangs in the air. From the factories in the East End, smoke still drifts upward, though the fires inside have long been damped. It mixes with the scent of wet iron and river water, a smell every Londoner knows. A policeman stands at a corner, his silhouette sharp against the lamplight. His eyes move without hurry, scanning the street for movement. A shadow crosses at the far end. Just a man with his collar up and hat low. But for an instant the constable's hand rests on his truncheon, instinctively wary of shapes half seen in the fog. There is a superstition among the lamplighters that on this night their flames burn lower than usual, as if reluctant to challenge the dark. One such man, coat buttoned tight and ladder balanced against his shoulder, makes his rounds with deliberate slowness. He pauses beneath each post, raising his pole to tend the flame, watching it catch and flutter weakly. He does not whistle tonight as he often does. Somewhere deep in him, older than memory, the night feels too alive for carelessness. Inside a narrow townhouse near Bloomsbury, the curtains are drawn tight, and the air smells faintly of wax and old books. A circle of chairs stands arranged in the parlour, their shadows overlapping like petals of a dark flower. On the mantel, a small clock ticks steadily, its brass pendulum glinting with each swing. The hour approaches 9. The fire burns low, its coals pulsing faintly red. Upon the table rests a bell, a bowl of salt, and a slate with chalk neatly laid beside it. A few candles stand ready, their wicks unlit, waiting for the hands that will soon strike the match. In the adjoining room, a woman adjusts her shawl before a mirror. Her reflection is faint in the dim light, the surface of the glass slightly warped. Her eyes are steady, though the skin beneath them shows the pale fatigue of someone accustomed to seeing more than most would wish to. Her name is Mrs. Halbrook, and for the past 7 years, she has conducted séances for London's curious elite. Her reputation is modest yet firm. She is not theatrical, not one of those who turn parlours into stage shows of floating trumpets and luminous hands. Hers is a quieter craft, practice for those who do not seek spectacle, but understanding. She turns from the mirror, smoothing the creases in her dark gown. A knock at the door announces the first of her guests. The maid admits them quietly, taking their coats and gloves with polite discretion. One by one, they gather in the parlour, gentlemen with moustaches neatly combed, ladies with pearls and lace cuffs, each carrying a mixture of scepticism and hope. They greet one another softly, as though afraid their voices might disturb something unseen. Among them are doctors, writers, widows, and one man whose presence makes the maid hesitate. A tall, lean figure with eyes that do not quite settle on anything. He removes his hat with mechanical politeness, but his silence holds a weight that makes the others glance away. The guests take their seats. The fire snaps faintly. The smell of candle wax drifts upward as Mrs. Halbrook lights the first taper. She moves with a calm precision, her gestures neither hurried nor hesitant. The flame catches, small and steady, casting a glow that touches the edges of the room. The light flickers across gilt-framed paintings, across a shelf of worn books, and finally across the silver bell on the table. The sound of the match being struck is sharp in the quiet, almost ceremonial. The woman sits at the head of the circle. Her voice is low, measured. "We gather not to command but to listen," she says. "We do not summon, we invite. The air will tell us what is willing to be heard." Her tone is not one of performance, but of instruction, as though she were a schoolteacher guiding her pupils through a familiar lesson. Around her, hands fold neatly atop laps. A murmur of assent passes through the circle. Outside, the fog presses softly against the windows, muting the sounds of the street. A carriage rattles by, its wheels distant. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then falls silent. Within the room, the candles waver slightly, their flames bending as though a draught has passed, though no door has opened. The guests shift subtly in their chairs. The tall man with the distant eyes lowers his gaze to his gloved hands, clasped tightly together. Mrs. Halbrook closes her eyes. The others follow. For a long moment, the room is still. The only sound is the steady rhythm of the clock. Each tick seems louder now, each second stretched. Then, softly, she begins to speak, not words of invocation, but of calm. She tells them to breathe, to let their thoughts quiet, to feel the weight of their bodies in the chairs, the pulse of the living that separates them from what they seek. Her voice falls into a pattern, rhythmic but not hypnotic, grounding rather than lifting. As she speaks, the air seems to grow denser. The warmth of the fire becomes distant, dulled by the quiet. The sound of the clock fades, or perhaps their ears simply adjust to a deeper frequency, one where smaller sounds rise to notice, the faint creak of wood, the rustle of fabric, the almost imperceptible sigh of someone's breath caught in hesitation. The candle flames lean again, all at once, as if moved by the same invisible current. No one moves. Mrs. Halbrook opens her eyes. They are clear and calm. "If there is a presence," she says softly, "let it be known gently." The words fall into the air and linger there, heavy and uncertain. The bell does not ring. The chalk remains still. But something in the air shifts. The fog outside thickens against the glass until even the lamplight beyond is smothered. The world feels smaller, the parlor a vessel floating in mist. The tall man exhales slowly, his fingers loosening. A faint tapping sound comes from the table. 3 light knocks, quick, precise, then silence. Every head turns. Mrs. Halbrook's expression remains neutral. She waits. Another 3 taps follow, slower this time, uneven, as though hesitant. The woman nods once, barely perceptible. "Are you among us still?" she asks quietly. The reply is a single, soft rap. Someone exhales sharply. A woman near the fireplace grips her husband's sleeve. The bell trembles faintly, though no hand has touched it. Mrs. Halbrook's tone remains steady. "We welcome you." The flame nearest her guttered, then straightened, stronger than before. Outside, the church bells begin to toll the hour. 10 slow, deliberate chimes roll through the fog, their echoes spreading like ripples across unseen water. Each tone vibrates through the window glass, resonating faintly in the floorboards. When the final chime fades, the silence feels thicker than before, as though the sound has drawn something nearer. The tapping resumes, softer now, coming not from the table, but the wall behind it. A rhythmic pattern, 2 knocks, pause, 1, pause, 2 again. Mrs. Halbrook listens carefully, counting under her breath. Then she nods slightly, turning to the man seated at her left. "It answers to you," she says. The man, a widower in his 50s with hands accustomed to trembling, lifts his head. "To me?" "Yes. Speak, if you wish." He swallows. His voice is thin. "If this is my Mary, if you hear me." He stops. The words seem too fragile for the air. He clears his throat, starts again. "If you are with us, give 1 knock." A pause. Then one soft, definite sound. The man's breath breaks. His hand trembles upon his knee. The woman beside him reaches out, steadying him with a touch. Mrs. Halbrook says nothing. She lets the silence hold, lets the moment belong to the man and whatever belief fills it. The others watch, silent. The clock ticks on. The widower speaks again, quieter. "Are you at peace?" This time, no answer comes. Only the creak of the floor beneath someone's shifting weight. The candle nearest the window flickers weakly, its wax running thin. The fog presses closer, wrapping the room in a grey hush. Mrs. Halbrook draws a slow breath. Sometimes they listen, but do not answer, she says. Not all voices find the same path back. Her words settle over them gently, neither comforting nor dismissive. The widower nods, his eyes wet but calm. Then I'll listen, he whispers. The medium gives him a small, genuine nod in return. The rest of the group sits in quiet reverence. The séance has begun not with spectacle, but with the fragile sincerity of longing. Outside, the city continues its muted rhythm. Carriages pass unseen, boots echo faintly on wet stone, and from far away, the faint whistle of a train drifts across the Thames. The world goes on, unaware of the small parlour where the living and the dead share an hour of uneasy company. The fog curls thicker around the house. The flames tremble. The clock strikes another minute, slow and deliberate. The séance is not yet deep, not yet dangerous, but something in the air tells that it will not remain gentle for long. The hour has only just begun, and beyond the reach of the candlelight, London's night waits, listening. The fog deepens, drawing close against the city's ribs, rolling slowly through alleys and over rooftops, until even the church spires seem to waver, like distant silhouettes seen through smoke. The air is heavy, with the scent of coal, iron, and damp wool. The kind of chill that creeps beneath the skin, clinging to every breath. London, that great machine of progress and poverty, hums quietly beneath its shroud, unaware or perhaps unwilling to notice that tonight it feels different. Tonight, every street lamp burns like a guardian's eye, each flame flickering against a weight that cannot be named. Along the Strand, the last of the cabs rattle toward home, their drivers hunched against the cold, collars turned high. The horses move slow, steam curling from their nostrils, hooves striking the wet stones with hollow rhythm. From the river, a low foghorn groans, its voice stretching through the mist like a warning too tired to frighten. Across the bridge, the dark outline of St. Paul's rises, its dome barely visible but unmistakable, a shape of permanence against a city built on uncertainty. At the edge of the bridge, a news vendor packs his stall, the gaslight above him painting his hands gold as he stacks the last unsold papers. The headlines speak of new wonders, electrical experiments in France, a new kind of medicine from Germany, a submarine engine tested off Portsmouth. Yet below those boasts, smaller notices whisper of other matters. Unexplained disturbances in a Kensington house, séances exposed, ghosts photographed on glass plates. He folds the paper neatly, shaking his head. He does not read the small print. He has seen enough strange things in London without paying for them. The river below is a living creature tonight, sluggish but restless. Each ripple catches the faint light and swallows it whole. A man stands at the railing, smoking a pipe, his reflection dissolving in the dark water beneath him. His face is lined with soot and fatigue, his hands raw from labour. He works the docks by day, where crates marked with distant names arrive on ships that smell of salt and rot. Tonight, he watches the current carry thin sheets of debris past, splinters of wood, a dead leaf, something that might once have been a scrap of cloth. He cannot say why he feels as though the river is listening back. When his pipe ember fades, he taps it out, straightens, and walks away, leaving the fog to reclaim the space he occupied. In a narrow alley behind Fleet Street, a cat darts across a puddle, its reflection rippling beneath the lamplight. The windows above are dim, most of them shuttered, but a few glow faintly where late workers lean over printing presses or writers pace their rooms. The city never truly sleeps. It only changes its face after dark. In one window, A man sits with a bottle and a notebook, writing hurriedly by candlelight. He is a journalist, weary but driven, chronicling the growing obsession with death that grips the polite circles of London. He has attended séances, heard the knockings, seen tables tremble. He has also seen charlatans collapse their own illusions. Yet the more he exposes, the more invitations arrive on his desk. London wants to believe. It always has. Farther west, in Mayfair, the fog glows faintly with reflected light from the grand houses that line the street. Gas lamps burn steadily here, tended hourly by attendants who make sure the glass stays clear and the flame even. A carriage pulls to a stop before one of the houses, its wheels crunching lightly over damp gravel. The door opens, and a young woman steps out, her cloak drawn tight. She glances briefly toward the street before ascending the steps. Behind her, the footman closes the carriage door and vanishes back into the mist, his lantern bobbing until it disappears entirely. Inside that house, candles are being arranged, chairs drawn into a circle, a table polished until the reflection of each flame can be seen trembling on its surface. London's fascination with the unseen has reached even the drawing rooms of the wealthy. The women who play Chopin by day and host teas by afternoon now gather after supper to listen for the dead. The servants whisper among themselves, crossing themselves quietly when their employers are not watching. Some refuse to enter the parlor after midnight. They have seen too much. The moving curtains, the bell that rings once after the house has gone still. But they stay, because the wages are good, and in London, belief alone does not feed the hungry. Outside, the lamplighters move in pairs now. The fog is too thick for safety. They speak little, their poles tapping softly against the cobbles as they walk. Occasionally one stops, adjusts a lamp, and watches as the flame flickers to life again. The light catches the edges of posters pasted to the brick walls, advertisements for lectures on mesmerism, pamphlets warning against the dangers of spiritualism, notices of missing persons. The ink runs faintly where the fog has touched it. Faces stare back from the posters, their expressions grainy and lifeless. The lamplighter looks at them a moment too long, then turns away. In the East End, the streets are narrower, the lamps fewer. Here the fog feels thicker, the shadows closer. The smell of smoke and refuse lingers heavy in the air. A woman hurries along the pavement, a shawl pulled over her head. She clutches a small bundle in her arms, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, the evening's meal. Behind her, footsteps echo faintly, but she does not turn, not tonight. On Halloween, no one looks behind them after dark. She passes a row of shuttered shops, the faint outlines of hand-painted signs visible through grime. A pub door opens briefly, spilling warm light and the sound of laughter into the street. For a second, she hesitates, tempted by the safety of company, but the voices inside sound rough, and the man in the doorway watches her too long. She keeps walking. The light fades behind her, swallowed by fog. At the far end of the street, a preacher stands upon a wooden crate, coat buttoned to his throat, voice raised to no one in particular. His breath fogs the air with every word. "The dead are not to be disturbed," he cries. "They are not to be called, nor courted, nor questioned." His voice echoes between the walls, lost in the mist. No one answers. Only a stray dog lopes past, its paws silent on the wet stones. The preacher lowers his hands, looks around at the empty street, and mutters a prayer to himself. Then he too vanishes into the fog, leaving only the echo of his warning behind. The bells strike the half hour. From somewhere deeper in the city, the faint clatter of train wheels hums through the air, a low metallic rhythm that merges with the whisper of the wind. London breathes in layers, The gentle laughter of a passing group of students, the hiss of a lamp, the murmur of a prayer whispered at an upstairs window. Every sound folds into the next, until the city becomes one long exhalation. And beneath it, something quieter still, the pulse of a night that is listening back. In a narrow mews near Kensington, a young boy sits on a stoop beside a stable door, hands cupped around a small candle stub. He watches the flame tremble each time the wind sighs through the cracks. His mother is inside, working late for a household that will not remember her name. He has been told to stay near the light, to keep it burning. He doesn't know why, only that his mother believes it keeps bad spirits from crossing the threshold. When the candle finally burns low, he pinches the wick between his fingers and whispers a promise to light another when she returns. The smoke curls upward, vanishing into the mist. Not far away, the clockmaker's shop stands silent, its windows lined with dozens of clocks that tick in imperfect unison. Inside, the air smells of oil and brass, of leather straps and cold metal. The old man who owns the place moves slowly among them, winding each one in turn, careful not to let the rhythm break. He has no customers at this hour. The clocks are company enough. As he adjusts the hand of a large mahogany timepiece, he pauses. For a moment, he thinks he hears another sound among the ticking, a softer rhythm, like breathing. He waits, listening. The sound fades. He shakes his head, chuckles at his own nerves, and moves on. But when he leaves the room, one clock keeps ticking out of sync, just slightly behind the rest, as though measuring a different kind of time. The fog drifts lower, thick enough now to dim even the nearest lamps. Somewhere near Whitechapel, two constables walk their beat in silence, their boots scuffing the stones. One carries a lantern, its light barely strong enough to show the road ahead. They speak in low voices about the rumours that always come with this night. Figures seen gliding through the fog, sounds of weeping near the churchyard, the smell of candles burning where none were lit. They do not believe, not truly, but still they walk faster past the cemetery gates. In that same cemetery, the fog moves differently. It swirls close to the ground, hugging the iron railings and stone markers. The names on the graves are worn smooth by weather and time, their letters softened into anonymity. A caretaker moves among them with a small lantern, checking that no one has broken in to disturb the peace. He knows the city's fascination with death brings visitors even to this place. Visitors who leave candles, letters, sometimes locks of hair. He stops beside one grave where the grass has been pressed down as though someone knelt there recently. A white flower rests against the stone, fresh despite the season. He bends to pick it up but hesitates. The petals are dry but unbruised, untouched by frost. He sets it back carefully and moves on, pretending not to notice that his lantern flame leans sharply, as though pushed by breath. Across the city, the hour deepens. The hum of carriages fades, replaced by the steady rhythm of footsteps and the distant tolling of unseen bells. London shrinks inward, its vastness folded into small circles of light where people huddle close to the familiar. Behind each window, lives unfold quietly. Families gathered by the fire, maids finishing their chores, scholars reading by lamplight. Yet, in more than a few of these rooms, the same ritual begins: the dimming of the lamp, the clearing of the table, the soft arrangement of chairs in a circle. The world of the living grows still, making space for the world that waits beside it. The gaslights outside hiss softly, burning steady and pale against the mist. Their glow stretches down each street like a line of patient sentinels, their reflections wavering in puddles where rainwater has gathered. The fog moves between them in slow, rolling waves, swallowing sound and shape alike. From time to time, A shadow crosses beneath the lamps, a figure moving purposefully, though direction is hard to tell. Sometimes it is only a man on his way home. Other times it feels as though the city itself is walking, restless in its own sleep. Inside one of the taller houses near Bloomsbury Square, where the windows glow faintly through the fog, the séance has begun to deepen. The circle of guests lean forward, their eyes wide, their hands linked. The air inside that room feels denser now, like the fog outside has found its way indoors. The candles flicker though the windows are sealed. The tapping at the table has grown softer, more deliberate, as though forming words. And somewhere in the city beyond, another flame bends with it, echoing the rhythm unseen. The gaslit streets outside remain patient. They hold the stories quietly, carrying the footsteps of the living and the whispers of the dead without favour or fear. The night has only begun to unfold, and the lamps burn on, steady but cautious, as London listens. The house on Bloomsbury Square breathes with the slow rhythm of waiting. The fog presses gently against the windows, dulling the sound of the city to a low, distant murmur. Inside, the air has grown warm and heavy. The candle flames waver faintly, their light sliding across the sheen of polished furniture and the faces of those seated in the circle. The clock on the mantel marks the seconds in soft, steady strokes, but no one glances toward it anymore. The hour has lost its shape. The room feels detached from the rest of London, as though the mist outside has folded around it and sealed it away. Mrs. Halbrook sits motionless, eyes half closed, her hands resting lightly on the table. The guests mimic her stillness, though beneath the calm their hearts move faster, shallow and restless. The air smells faintly of wax, old wood, and the trace of salt from the bowl set near the candle. Every detail feels deliberate. The curtains are drawn tight, the gas sconces turned off, the mirrors covered. The only light comes from the slow, uneven flicker of flame, which paints the room in shades of amber and shadow. Someone coughs softly, an embarrassed sound that dies before it finishes. A woman in a pale gown shifts slightly, the lace at her wrist trembling. Her husband gives her a faint, reassuring glance, though his own jaw tightens. The tall man, who has remained silent since his arrival, sits near the end of the table, his gaze lowered, his fingers pressed firmly against the edge of his chair. The movement of his throat betrays the strain of holding composure. Mrs. Holbrook opens her eyes. The colour of them has dulled in the candlelight, taking on the same hue as the shadows. "Do not think," she says quietly. "Only listen." Her voice carries the weight of instruction, not comfort. Around the table, the subtle creak of wood answers her, as though the house itself obeys. The silence deepens, thick and almost tactile. Outside, the sound of a carriage wheel fades into distance, replaced by the softer rhythm of rain beginning against the glass. Each drop hits with delicate insistence, steady, hypnotic. Then, without warning, the curtain nearest the door stirs. It moves slowly, like breath caught between hesitation and intent. The maid who stands near the wall freezes, her hand halfway to her apron. Mrs. Halbrook does not look toward the movement. "Let it pass," she murmurs. The fabric sways again, its hem brushing lightly against the floor. The guests exchange nervous glances. One of the candles flickers lower, its flame bending sharply toward the disturbance, before straightening once more. The sound that follows is almost imperceptible, a soft rustling like paper folded carefully and then unfolded again. It comes from behind the curtain near the window. The widower leans forward slightly, his breath audible. "Is that..." Mrs. Halbrook raises her hand. Wait! The rustling stops. For a moment, only the rain speaks, soft and persistent. The room's warmth begins to feel oppressive, as though the air itself thickens around them. The tall man at the end of the table glances toward the curtain and frowns. The candlelight catches the edge of his profile, revealing the tension that has settled there. He opens his mouth as if to speak, but the sound that emerges is not his. A whisper, faint and breathless, threads through the air. It does not come from any single place, but seems to drift above the table, soft as the sound of a sigh carried through another room. The words are unclear at first, more vibration than speech. Then, slowly, a single phrase forms. A woman's voice, calm and distant, as though speaking from the bottom of a dream. Do you remember me? The guests stiffen. A chair leg scrapes faintly against the rug. The widower's face pales, his hands trembling in his lap. He opens his mouth, but no sound escapes. Mrs. Halbrook's eyes remain steady. If you wish to speak, she says softly, we listen. The whisper returns, clearer now, though still distant. It is cold. The widower's breath catches audibly. Mary, he whispers. No reply. Only the faint swaying of the curtain again, brushing the floor as though a hand grazes it from the other side. The woman beside him reaches out, covering his shaking hand with her own. Mrs. Halbrook's gaze moves to the flame nearest her. It bends, shivers, and then steadies again. Her voice lowers. If you are cold, there is warmth here. You are not forgotten. For a heartbeat, the silence feels absolute. Then the bell upon the table trembles faintly, its sound thin and uneven. The vibrations travel through the surface of the table into the guests' fingertips. A murmur ripples through the room, half fear, half wonder. From the far end, the tall man exhales sharply. His voice is rough when he speaks. How do you know this isn't some draft or trick of the air? We are fools to think the dead sit waiting for our call. His tone is not cruel, but strained, almost pleading for someone to agree. The others avoid his eyes. Mrs. Halbrook regards him quietly. You are free to doubt, she says. Doubt keeps us human. But even you feel that the air listens differently tonight. He does not answer. His gaze drifts toward the curtain again, where the movement has stopped, but the impression of presence lingers, heavy as breath. The maid shifts her weight near the door, her knuckles white against her apron. She does not speak. She has seen smaller things in this house. A flicker where there should be none. The faint impression of footsteps on a rug left smooth. But tonight the air itself feels like a held breath, and even she cannot find logic in that. The rain outside intensifies, tapping harder against the glass. The rhythm builds, steady and uneven at once, until it becomes a pattern of sound that fills the silence with its insistence. One of the gentlemen murmurs something about the storm, but the words trail off as another sound cuts through it. A faint, rhythmic knock. 3 taps, evenly spaced, from the wall behind Mrs. Halbrook. Then silence. She turns her head slightly, eyes narrowing toward the source. That is not the window, she says, almost to herself. The knock repeats, softer this time, from the same spot. The wall there is lined with framed sketches and an old mirror, its surface draped with black cloth. The guests lean forward, the candlelight glinting in their eyes. Mrs. Halbrook gestures to the man nearest the wall. Will you touch it? Just once. He hesitates, then stands, his chair creaking behind him. The floorboards protest softly under his weight as he steps closer. The knock sounds again, directly beneath his hand. He stops. He does not touch the wall. His voice is barely audible. It's warm. The room stills. The rain, the clock, even the breathing of those present seems to fall away for a moment. Mrs. Halbrook speaks quietly, her tone unchanged. If warmth remains, then perhaps what lingers is not lost. The man steps back quickly, his expression pale and uncertain. He resumes his seat without a word. The whisper returns, softer now, almost hidden beneath the rain. "Don't go." The widower bows his head. "I'm here," he says. "I've not gone anywhere." The candles waver. The curtain stirs once more, then settles. The room exhales. Minutes pass without movement. The air cools slightly. The warmth from the wall dissipates, leaving only the faint scent of wax and the damp smell of rain pressing through the seams of the window. Mrs. Halbrook leans back slightly, her voice steady but quieter now. "What we hear may be echoes," she says, "or it may be memory given sound. The difference is less than we wish to believe." No one answers. Some nod, others keep their gaze on the table. The tall man rubs his temples as though to drive away a headache that has begun to pulse just behind his eyes. The sound of the rain steadies into a dull rhythm again, like breathing through a wall. From the corridor beyond the door comes a faint sound of movement. Footsteps, light and hesitant, the boards creaking softly beneath invisible weight. The maid looks toward the noise, then back to Mrs. Halbrook. The woman gives a slight nod, and the maid, though reluctant, steps into the hall. The sound fades as she goes. Only the ticking clock remains, slow and patient. When she returns a moment later, her face is pale. "There's no one," she says quietly. "But the back door was open." Mrs. Halbrook's expression remains composed. "Latch it." The maid hesitates. "Shall I bolt it, madam?" "Not yet, just the latch." The maid obeys, vanishing once more into the hall. The tall man's voice breaks the silence again, though lower now. "You believe this," he says. "All of it?" Mrs. Halbrook does not look at him. "Belief is not what keeps the dead away," she replies. "Respect is." The wind presses faintly against the window panes. The flame nearest the curtain bends again, then steadies. Somewhere deeper in the house, the floor creaks. A slow, weighty sound, not of footsteps, but of the building itself adjusting to the hour. One of the ladies at the table whispers a prayer beneath her breath. The faint rhythm of her words lost almost immediately to the steady tick of the clock. Mrs. Halbrook looks toward the widower, whose gaze remains fixed on the curtain. "Would you speak again?" she asks gently. He hesitates. His voice trembles when he answers. "Mary, are you here still?" The whisper that comes this time is barely sound at all, more vibration than word, but it is there, unmistakably. "Always." The widower's eyes close. A single tear runs down his cheek. The others do not speak, unwilling to break the fragile balance of the room. Mrs. Halbrook lowers her gaze, her fingers brushing lightly over the surface of the table. The faintest tremor passes through it, like the vibration of a note played far away. "Then she has not gone far," she murmurs. The curtain sways once more, slower this time, and settles. The whisper fades with it, drawn back into the stillness. The candles burn evenly now, their flames steady and small. The rain softens, becoming a faint mist that traces the window with thin silver lines. The guests exhale almost in unison, as though waking from a shared trance. The tall man rubs his eyes. The woman beside the widower wipes her own quietly with a handkerchief. The maid returns to her post near the door, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Halbrook looks around the circle, her voice calm. "Sometimes they come because they are called. Sometimes because they have nowhere else to go. We are only the space between." The room absorbs her words without reaction. The city outside continues to breathe, steady and unseen. The fog has thickened again, pressing close to the windows until the faint reflection of the candlelight seems to hang suspended in it. Beyond that curtain of mist, London lies stretched in endless layers of shadow, its streets whispering with life and memory alike. Somewhere in that darkness, another house waits, its curtains drawn, its table cleared, its occupants gathering as the hour deepens. The air carries the same heaviness, the same expectation. The night moves on, quietly shifting from one room to another, one listener to the next, carrying whispers wherever belief makes room for them. The rain slows to a whisper, a steady rhythm fading into the soft hiss of the fog against the glass. The candles burn low now, their wax pooled at their bases, thin streams running over the edges and hardening as they fall. The air inside the parlor feels changed. Not colder, not warmer, only more alert, as though the very walls have begun to listen. The faint smell of damp wood and extinguished flame lingers, carried from the chimney where the fire has dwindled to dull embers. The guests sit in silence, each lost in a private shape of thought, their eyes unfocused, their breathing shallow. The séance has not ended, but it has shifted into something quieter, something that waits to be named. Mrs. Halbrook does not move for a long while. Her hands rest on the table, palms down, fingers slightly spread. Her gaze is fixed on the darkened space between the candles, where the faint reflection of the flame shivers upon the polished surface. She breathes evenly, her expression unreadable, her posture precise. The others look to her for instruction, but she gives none. The silence is its own command. Outside, the fog glows faintly where a street lamp burns behind it. The shape of the window has almost vanished, swallowed by the thickness of the night. The sound of the city has quieted until only the distant echo of carriage wheels remains, soft and intermittent. London has folded inward. The gas lamps gutter and the houses sleep. Only a few rooms still burn with light, and one of them is this. The maid stands near the wall, her eyes fixed on the door that leads to the hallway. She has not forgotten that she found it unlatched. She has locked it now, the bolt drawn, but the memory of the open door sits in her like a small, unwelcome weight. She keeps her distance from the table, her hands clasped tightly, her breath shallow. Mrs. Halbrook finally moves, the motion subtle. She draws a slow breath, lifts her head, and looks around the circle. Her eyes are calm, her voice steady. "It listens still," she says. Not the same voice as before, but another that has not yet found its courage. The words hang in the air. The widower looks up, his expression uncertain. "There are more?" "There are always more," she replies. "We do not summon one, but open a door, and what stands beyond does not move alone." The tall man shifts slightly in his chair, his face drawn and pale. "Then we should close it," he says. "You've made your point. Whatever we heard, it's enough." Mrs. Halbrook does not answer him. Instead, she lowers her gaze once more to the table. Her fingers trace the faint ring left by the base of the candle. The movement is delicate, almost thoughtful. "To close it before it speaks," she murmurs, "is to invite it to linger." The guests exchange glances. The tension in the room feels like the pause between breaths. No one wishes to anger what they do not understand, yet no one wishes to leave it unfinished. The candle nearest the widow flickers, its flame shrinking before swelling again. The air stirs faintly, though the windows are shut tight. The curtain moves once, slow and deliberate, as if brushed by something invisible. A faint chill spreads outward from the table, a cold that is not physical but recognized all the same. The maid's hand rises to her throat without thought. Mrs. Halbrook closes her eyes again. Her voice drops lower, becoming softer, less like speech and more like thought. If you are near, speak without fear. The living will not drive you away. For a moment, nothing changes. Then the table beneath their hands trembles. It is a small motion at first, barely enough to be certain of. Then again, stronger, steady. A sound rises with it, the faint scrape of wood against wood, the whisper of pressure moving through the grain. The widower gasps. "It moves!" Mrs. Halbrook's tone remains calm. "Let it." The table shifts again, an inch, maybe less. The vibrations pulse through the circle, subtle but insistent. The candle flames flutter. One of the women stifles a cry. The tall man leans forward, his skepticism now threaded with fear. He watches closely, searching for ropes, for wires, for trickery, but there are none. The movement is too organic, too uneven to be mechanical. It feels alive. The sound changes. A soft, rhythmic tapping begins at the underside of the table. Not random, but deliberate. 1, pause, 2, pause, 3. A pattern. Mrs. Halbrook opens her eyes. "Yes," she says quietly. "You may use the code." The guests look at her in confusion. "What code?" someone asks. She does not answer them directly. 1 for yes, she says, addressing the air. 2 for no. The tapping responds. 1 sharp knock. A murmur ripples through the group. The widower's hands tighten against the wood. The woman beside him whispers a prayer under her breath. The maid steps back a pace, her foot catching the edge of the rug. Mrs. Halbrook's gaze softens. "You are welcome here," she says to the space before her. "You may speak what you wish. We will hear you." The table shifts again, the movement subtle but unmistakable. The tapping begins once more. 1 knock, pause, 1 more, then 3 in quick succession. The pattern is too deliberate to ignore. "Letters," Mrs. Halbrook says quietly. "It spells." The guests exchange glances, uncertain. "Spells?" the tall man repeats, half incredulous. "Yes," she says. 1 for A, 2 for B, and so on. It is not always clear, but it is language of its own. She begins to count softly under her breath, marking the knocks as they come. Her lips move silently, her fingers twitching slightly as if tracing invisible words. After a moment, she stops. Her eyes lift toward the ceiling. It says, "Help." The word lands in the room like a weight. The silence that follows is thick, fragile. No one moves. The tall man breaks it. "You're guessing," he says, though his voice lacks conviction. "It could mean anything." Mrs. Halbrook does not answer him. She leans forward, her tone low. "Who asks for help?" The reply comes quickly. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2. She counts again, lips moving faintly. "E, D." The widower swallows hard. "Edward," he whispers. The sound that answers is 1 sharp knock. He sits back, pale. His hands tremble visibly now. "My son," he says softly. "He died last winter." Mrs. Halbrook's expression remains calm, but her voice loses its measured precision. "He calls to you?" The widower nods once, unable to speak. The table trembles again, stronger now, enough to make the candles sway. The wax drips down in thin streams, the shadows in the room stretching and collapsing with each flicker of flame. The knocking grows erratic, faster, less measured, as though struggling to form words that the living cannot keep pace with. Mrs. Halbrook speaks above the noise. "Edward, if you are here, slow your hand. Speak gently." The sounds falter, then cease. The silence that follows is sharper than before. Then a single knock. "Do you wish to speak to your father?" 1 knock. Are you in peace? 2 knocks. The widower lowers his head into his hands. His voice breaks. I'm sorry, he murmurs. I didn't come before. I couldn't bear to hear it. A soft rustle moves through the room, a motion without source. The flame nearest him bends sharply toward his side, though no draught follows. The sound of the knocking resumes, slow, rhythmic, gentle now, like a heartbeat pressed against wood. Mrs. Halbrook's eyes glisten faintly. She steadies her breath. He forgives you, she says quietly. The restless do not linger for anger, only longing. The widower's shoulders tremble, but he does not look up. The others avert their eyes, caught between reverence and unease. The maid crosses herself, the movement small and quick. Outside, the fog has thickened until the glass itself seems opaque. The gaslights beyond appear only as faint, pale circles. The city has disappeared, leaving only this room and the slow pulse of its strange conversation. The candles hiss faintly as the last of their wax pools into translucent shapes. Mrs. Halbrook glances toward the tall man. You feel it too, she says quietly. He meets her gaze, reluctant. I feel something, he admits, but not peace. Peace seldom comes first, she replies. It waits until we listen fully. He looks away. The rhythm of the knocking slows until it stops altogether. The table grows still. The air, however, does not return to its ordinary weight. It holds a density that hums faintly, a kind of resonance that vibrates just beneath the edge of hearing. From somewhere behind the curtain, a soft thump breaks the quiet. It is not sharp, not threatening, merely the sound of something settling or perhaps standing. The maid turns toward it, her breath caught. Mrs. Halbrook lifts her head, her voice barely audible. Do not turn. The guests obey instinctively. No one looks toward the window. The sound comes again, softer this time, a slow shift of fabric, the creak of wood beneath unseen weight. Sometimes, she says, what listens grows bold. The flame nearest her flares briefly, a sudden pulse of light that casts long shadows across the walls. In that moment, the curtain's edge moves. No gust of air, no visible cause, simply a slow, deliberate motion as if brushed aside by a passing figure. The light flickers, bends, and returns to stillness. The tall man's hands grip the edge of his chair. His knuckles whiten. You said we should not turn, he whispers. But if something stands there... Mrs. Halbrook's gaze remains fixed on the table. It stands because you called, she says, and it will leave only when you stop fearing that it won't. The room seems to breathe again. The sound of the rain fades entirely, replaced by the deep, hollow silence of late hours. The candles burn lower, their flames thin and constant. The air cools gradually, the heaviness lifting as though a door has closed softly somewhere unseen. Mrs. Halbrook releases a slow breath and looks around the circle. The parlour is awake now, she says. It will not rest until dawn. The others remain still, unsure whether the words bring comfort or warning. The widower keeps his head bowed. The tall man sits rigid, eyes fixed on nothing. The rest simply breathe, each lost in their own fragile quiet. Beyond the walls, London stirs faintly again. A cart rattles somewhere in the distance. A bell tolls from an unseen church, slow and measured. The fog presses outward from the windows, drifting once more into the streets. The house, however, does not settle. The boards beneath the parlour still hum with the faint memory of movement, the echo of voices that spoke without sound. Mrs. Halbrook rises at last. The others watch her without moving. She does not speak again, only begins to extinguish the candles one by one. With each small breath of darkness, the room seems to sigh, the faint traces of warmth fading into still air. The final candle burns alone, its flame steady and sharp. The maid steps forward. "Shall I snuff it, madam?" Mrs. Halbrook shakes her head. "No, leave it. The night is not finished." The maid hesitates, then nods, retreating to her place by the wall. The guests remain seated, unable to decide whether they should stay or rise. The faint scent of wax and smoke fills the room. Outside, the fog moves gently against the glass, brushing it like a slow tide. The city beyond remains unseen, but it listens still. And somewhere, in another parlor across London, another candle burns low. Another table waits for the first sound of tapping. Another set of hands trembles above polished wood. The hour deepens, and the living lean closer to the dark. The single candle burns lower, its flame thin but steady, the wax around it forming a shallow ring that gleams like a small pool of amber light. The parlour is quiet again, but it is not the stillness of peace. It is the kind of quiet that follows a sound you know will return. The air hums faintly, stretched thin between expectation and restraint. The guests sit without speaking, their bodies rigid, their eyes half-lidded, as if waking from a heavy sleep. The walls seem closer now, the faint smell of wax, smoke, and the lingering trace of damp earth clings to every surface. The fire in the grate has died entirely, leaving only a dull shimmer of ash. A draught moves faintly across the floor, though the doors are shut. Mrs. Halbrook stands by the table, her silhouette framed against the dim light. Her movements are deliberate, unhurried. She adjusts the position of the candle slightly, centering it between the silver bell and the slate board. The flame leans, then rights itself, the shadows shifting softly across the faces of the guests. "We are not finished," she says, her voice low but even. "The first has passed, but others wait." The widower looks up, his eyes hollow. "How many?" She shakes her head. "As many as the living allow." The tall man exhales sharply through his nose. "Then it never ends, does it?" Mrs. Halbrook does not answer. She draws her chair closer and sits, folding her hands upon the table. "If you fear the sound," she says, "listen longer. The truth rarely whispers once." The room settles around her words. The guests exchange quiet, uncertain glances, but no one speaks. The maid closes the parlour door softly, leaving only the faint murmur of the city somewhere beyond the walls. The fog presses close against the windows again, erasing any distinction between the world inside and the world without. For a moment, there is only silence. Then softly, the first sound begins. A light tap beneath the table, almost tentative. It comes once, then again, slightly louder. The sound is unmistakable, wood against wood. Mrs. Halbrook's eyes lift, though she does not appear startled. "You may speak," she says. The tapping continues, deliberate now, forming a rhythm that is not random. 1, pause, 2, pause, 1. The guests lean forward, the movement unconscious. The sound is sharper this time, as though made by a harder object. A knuckle, perhaps, or something small and heavy striking the underside of the wood. The tall man watches carefully, his eyes flicking from face to face, searching for deceit. But every hand in the circle remains visible, each palm open, resting still. The knocks continue, steady, insistent. Mrs. Halbrook listens closely, her head tilted slightly. "You are not the same voice as before," she says. "Who are you?" The knocks respond, 2 quick strikes, then 3 slower ones. She begins to count under her breath. B-E-N. She stops, frowning slightly. Benjamin. The name hangs in the air. The widower straightens, startled. My brother's boy, he says quietly. He drowned near the wharf last year. A single knock follows immediately, one for yes. The man's expression collapses into something raw. His hands clench, then loosen again. Benjamin, he whispers. You poor child. The knocking quickens briefly, uneven, almost urgent, then stops. Mrs. Halbrook's tone softens. He hears you. The man shakes his head. He was 10 years old. He shouldn't still be wandering. No one should, she says. But they do. The next sound is different. A low, resonant thud, as though something larger than a hand has struck the table from below. The entire surface shudders. The candle flame bends sharply, then steadies again. One of the women gasps, pressing her hand to her mouth. Mrs. Halbrook lifts her hand slowly, palm open. If you are near, speak with care. You are welcome, but not uninvited. The table moves again, sliding half an inch toward her. The sound of the wood against the carpet is soft but distinct. The movement stops as suddenly as it began. The tall man swallows hard, his skepticism thinning. Someone's pushing it. Then prove it, Mrs. Halbrook says quietly. He hesitates. His jaw works as he considers. Then he places his palms flat upon the surface. If this is real, then move it again. The others hold their breath. The silence stretches long enough for doubt to flicker. Then, without warning, the table jerks sideways, just once, sharp enough to rattle the candle holder. The flame trembles, but does not go out. The tall man jerks his hands back, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. That's enough, he says, voice unsteady. I won't be made a fool of. Mrs. Halbrook's expression remains calm. No one makes you anything you are not willing to be. He stands, his breath uneven, but he does not leave. His eyes dart toward the window, where the faint reflection of the candle flame glows against the curtain. For a moment, something else seems to shimmer there, a faint, pale distortion in the fabric, like heat rising from a road. Then it is gone. The tapping resumes, softer now, but faster. It seems to move along the length of the table, from one side to the other, as though pacing. Then, abruptly, it stops. Mrs. Halbrook speaks into the silence. If you wish to speak, use the board. She reaches for the slate and chalk, sliding them toward the centre. The chalk rolls slightly, coming to rest beside the flame. For a heartbeat, nothing happens. Then the chalk moves. Slowly, hesitantly, it drags itself across the surface, leaving a faint white line. It hesitates, then continues, forming another. The motion is slow and irregular, but deliberate. When it stops, Mrs. Halbrook leans forward, reading the faint markings. The letters are crude but clear enough. M-E-R-R-Y. Mary, she says softly. The widower frowns. Mary! The chalk moves again, scratching more urgently now. Mary Field, she reads aloud. The tall man stares. The old shipyard. Yes, the widower says, his voice trembling. That's where Benjamin drowned. The chalk stills. Then, in one long, uneven motion, it draws a final line beneath the word, almost like a signature. The air feels heavier. The table creaks faintly as though bearing a new weight. Mrs. Halbrook's voice lowers. He returns to where he was lost. The widower presses his fist against his mouth, eyes wet. He's just a boy, he whispers. Mrs. Halbrook closes her eyes briefly. The sea takes what it wishes, she says, but sometimes it forgets to let go. The candle flickers. For the first time, a faint sound rises beyond the room, a hollow, distant rhythm, soft but unmistakable. It is the sound of water lapping against wood, though no river lies near enough to be heard. The guests freeze. The sound grows stronger for a moment, then fades again, leaving only the faint tick of the clock. The tall man sits slowly, his chair creaking beneath him. "You can't tell me that was real," he says, though the certainty in his voice has thinned to almost nothing. Mrs. Halbrook opens her eyes. "You may tell yourself whatever lets you sleep," she says quietly, "but the dead are not bound by our comfort." The tapping begins again, softer now, slower, almost gentle. It forms a single pattern, 3 knocks, a pause, 1, then 2. Mrs. Halbrook listens, counting silently. "Goodbye," she translates. The table falls still. The air lightens. The faint sense of weight that had settled over them begins to fade. The widower exhales shakily, leaning back. His eyes remain fixed on the slate. "He said goodbye," he murmurs. "He found rest," Mrs. Halbrook says. "That is more than most." The maid exhales softly, the tension leaving her shoulders. She glances toward the curtain again, still half expecting movement, but it remains still. The candlelight glows faintly against the fabric, the fog beyond thick as wool. For a few moments, the room feels almost peaceful. The faint crackle of the dying wick fills the silence. The guests breathe again. Someone shifts their chair. A soft sigh moves through the circle. But peace does not linger long in such places. The moment the relief begins to settle, the sound returns. Not a knock this time, but a faint vibration, a tremor running through the table's surface. It is deeper than before, almost subsonic, like a low hum felt through the floorboards. The candle flame bends backward, pulled by an unseen draft that feels like breath. Mrs. Halbrook straightens slowly. "There is another," she says quietly. The widower looks at her, startled. "Another? After that?" "The door remains open," she answers, "until the night closes it." The humming deepens. The silver bell on the table trembles, the faintest ring rising from its base. The chalk rolls again, stopping against the slate. The guests draw back instinctively, though none of them speak. The air feels thick, electric, charged with something that vibrates just beyond comprehension. The maid moves toward the window, but Mrs. Holbrook's voice stops her. "Do not open the curtains." She freezes mid-step, nods, and retreats. The sound becomes a steady rhythm, pulsing through the table, through the floor, through the walls. The flame trembles violently, stretching long before recovering. The widower grips his knees, eyes wide. The tall man watches, his skepticism eroding in the face of something that logic cannot easily explain. Then, as suddenly as it began, the vibration ceases. The silence that follows is immense. Every sound, the creak of the house, the faint hiss of the lamp, even the rhythm of breath, feels louder in its absence. Mrs. Halbrook's voice is barely a whisper. "Who stays?" The reply comes not in knocks, not in sound, but in scent. The air changes, carrying a faint, sweet odour, roses, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the smell of wax and smoke. The guests look around in confusion, searching for flowers that are not there. One of the women gasps softly. "That smell. My sister wore the same." Mrs. Halbrook nods faintly. "She is here." The woman trembles, her eyes filling with tears. "She died in spring." "Yes," Mrs. Halbrook says, and she brings the scent of her last hour with her. The dead remember through what lingers. The rose scent thickens, filling the parlor until it feels tangible, wrapping around them like fabric. The candle burns brighter, its light no longer steady but alive, pulsing faintly as though breathing. The woman begins to weep softly, her shoulders shaking. The widower reaches to steady her hand. The tall man sits motionless, eyes fixed on the flame. The scent fades gradually, dissolving into the still air. The candle steadies once more. Mrs. Halbrook's voice is calm. They come when they are missed, and they leave when they are heard. The maid crosses herself again, silently. The clock on the mantel strikes once. 11:30. The sound echoes briefly, then disappears into the heavy quiet. Outside, the fog moves slower now, drifting like smoke from an invisible fire. The gaslights along the street burn dim, their halos soft and blurred. Somewhere far away, a bell tolls again, its tone deep and resonant. Inside, the guests remain in their circle, still unwilling to move. Mrs. Holbrook sits with her eyes closed, her hands folded neatly on her lap. The candle's flame shrinks, flickers, and steadies once more. The séance continues, unbroken, as the night draws deeper. The table stands ready, the air holds its breath, and somewhere beyond the curtain, unseen voices wait for the next invitation. The hour has grown heavy. The room carries the weight of spent candlelight, the wax cooled in pale rings around their bases. The flame that remains burns low, small but persistent, its light stretching thin over the table, where the guests sit unmoving, waiting without knowing for what. The air has the thickness of exhaustion, yet beneath it, something hums, an energy that refuses to fade, like the faint vibration that lingers in the floorboards after a carriage has passed. The clock on the mantel ticks evenly, indifferent to the strangeness that surrounds it. Outside, the fog presses still against the windows, its glow faint, the gaslight behind it struggling to break through. Mrs. Halbrook sits very still. Her hands rest loosely in her lap now, her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow but steady. The others watch her quietly, uncertain if she has entered the same calm she asks of the dead, or if the weight of the evening has finally pressed her inward. Her posture remains precise, spine straight, shoulders relaxed, head tilted slightly as if listening to a sound beneath the silence. The widower studies her face, his own lined and tired. The woman beside him has stopped crying, but her eyes remain glassy, her hands folded tightly together. The tall man, once restless, has gone silent, his skepticism worn thin by what he cannot unsee. The maid stands in the corner, motionless except for the faint tremor of her hands. The house feels suspended, as though the night outside has withdrawn its breath to listen. Mrs. Halbrook's lips move faintly. No words at first, just the rhythm of breath becoming something close to speech. Her voice, when it comes, is soft, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the candle's flame. "Do not speak," she says, her tone distant, unfocused. "Listen with more than your ears." Her head tilts slightly to the side. The movement is small but strange, like a puppet's cord being pulled. Her eyes roll upward, only the faint rim of iris visible beneath her lids. The room tightens with quiet tension. No one moves. She inhales slowly, and when she exhales, her voice is not quite her own. It is lower, rougher at the edges, as though filtered through distance. "There are too many," it murmurs. The widower's breath catches. "What do you mean?" Her head jerks slightly, then steadies. "They crowd," she says, the syllables drawn out, uneven. The door is open and they see the light. They do not remember what it means. The maid steps back against the wall, her hand rising instinctively to her throat. Mrs. Halbrook's hands twitch once, then relax. Her eyes remain closed. Some have waited years, she says. Some do not know the year at all. They come to warmth. They come to sound. Her tone shifts mid-sentence, softening, breaking. When she speaks again, the words seem pulled from her throat by something unseen. Thomas, she says. Thomas, where is the child? The widower straightens, startled. Who is Thomas? The voice that answers is still hers, but not. He went to sea, it says. He said he would bring her a ribbon. The river took him. The tall man leans forward, his voice low. Who speaks now? Her eyes snap open, but the gaze is unfocused, the pupils wide and unseeing. Do not name me, she says. It keeps me from rest. The words hang in the air, heavy and slow. The guests look at one another, uncertain whether to respond. The candle flickers, bending toward her as though drawn. The sound begins again beneath the table, a faint tapping, irregular, restless. The knocks come faster, then stop, then start again, forming no clear pattern. The wood vibrates faintly under their hands. Mrs. Halbrook's breathing quickens. Her fingers curl slightly, pressing against the fabric of her gown. They do not speak as we do, she murmurs. They move through touch, through sound, through memory. Too many voices, too much wanting. Her head tilts again, sharply this time, her hair falling loose from its pins. A small gasp rises from one of the guests, quickly swallowed. The maid takes a hesitant step forward. Madam. Mrs. Halbrook's voice changes once more, a faint tremor at the edge of each word. Do not disturb her, the sound says. She is borrowed. The maid freezes. The air in the room thickens further. The light seems dimmer, though the candle still burns. Every shadow deepens, stretching outward like spilled ink. The guests remain seated, hands frozen upon their laps, faces caught between awe and alarm. The sound beneath the table grows stronger. 3 knocks, pause, 3 again, the rhythm quick and uneven. Mrs. Halbrook's head tilts downward and a thin breath escapes her lips. He calls again, she whispers. The boy. But there are others with him now. They do not mean harm, but they are hungry for notice. The widower's voice shakes. Hungry? For the warmth of your names, she says, for the sound that reminds them they lived. Her eyes open again, though they remain distant. They press, she murmurs, so many hands upon the glass. The guests follow her gaze toward the window. The fog outside moves strangely, swirling close to the pane in patterns that mimic movement. It looks, for an instant, like the imprint of fingers sliding downward across the glass, leaving faint trails of condensation. The tall man rises halfway from his chair, staring. What is that? Mrs. Halbrook's head turns sharply toward him. Do not look too long, she says, though the voice carries a tone not her own. It remembers faces. He sits slowly, his breathing uneven. The fog outside settles again, flattening into stillness. The maid whispers something inaudible, clutching the crucifix that hangs beneath her collar. Mrs. Halbrook's body relaxes suddenly. Her head droops forward, chin against chest. The silence that follows is total. For a moment, it seems as though she has collapsed. Then she draws a long, shuddering breath, and the words that follow are barely audible. Too cold, she murmurs. So far to come back, so far. The widower leans forward. Can you hear us? She does not answer. Her breathing slows again, shallow and even. Then, in a tone that sounds almost like her own, she whispers, He stands by the river. The others exchange uneasy looks. The boy? The widower asks. She nods faintly. He waits for someone to walk him home. The man covers his face with his hands. He was never found. He will not be, she says softly. Not in the way you think. Some are claimed by places that do not return what they take. Her words fade into a sigh. The table creaks faintly, the sound of wood settling after strain. The candle burns lower still, the wick bent into the molten pool of wax. The tall man swallows hard. If you can speak to them, he says, then ask what they want. Ask what keeps them. Mrs. Halbrook's head turns slightly in his direction, though her eyes remain half closed. They want to be seen, she says. But sight is a wound for them now. It burns where memory used to live. Her tone is neither pity nor fear, simply description, detached and precise. The others listen, motionless. The knocking resumes, slower this time. One knock, pause, one again, as if calling softly for attention. Mrs. Halbrook's lips move, counting silently. Her expression changes, confusion flickering across her face. It says nothing, she murmurs, only repeats the same sound over and over. The sound continues. Knock, pause, knock, pause. The rhythm is steady, patient, infinite. The widower's shoulders shake. He can't find his way, he says quietly. Mrs. Halbrook nods once. Then we must lead him. Her hands lift slowly, palms upward, fingers slightly curled. We will count the hours backward, she says. Return him to the beginning. She begins to speak numbers softly, descending, each slower than the last. 10, 9, 8. The guests follow without instruction, their voices blending into a low murmur. The sound fills the room, calm but heavy, like a prayer stripped of its words. As the counting continues, the candle flame steadies. The knocking softens, fading with each number until, when she reaches one, it stops entirely. Mrs. Halbrook exhales, her shoulders lower, her posture easing, her eyes open, and for the first time they seem focused again. She blinks slowly, disoriented. How long? She asks. The maid answers quietly. Half an hour, perhaps. Mrs. Halbrook nods faintly. She lifts the candle, examining the flame as though unsure it is real. Then she sets it down again. He is gone now, she says. The rest will wait. The tall man runs a hand down his face. How can you bear this? She looks at him, her expression unreadable. It is not bearing, she says. It is remembering for those who cannot. The widower speaks softly. Do you ever fear what follows you after? Her eyes drift toward the darkened window. Always, she says, but fear is the only door the living have left open. The clock on the mantel strikes once, its tone deep and resonant. Midnight draws close. The fog outside thickens again, pressing against the glass until even the faint light of the street lamps disappears. The house feels isolated, untethered from the world beyond its walls. Mrs. Halbrook straightens in her chair, the faint weariness lifting from her shoulders. There is one more yet, she says. He waits longer than the rest. He does not speak through sound, but through breath. The guests exchange uneasy glances. Breath? The tall man asks. She nods slowly. The kind that moves the flame without wind, the kind that fills the lungs of sleepers. The candle flickers once, as if in recognition. The flame stretches tall, then steadies again. The room grows cooler. Mrs. Halbrook closes her eyes once more. Her voice becomes barely a whisper. He comes quietly. The air shifts, subtle but undeniable. A faint breeze stirs the hair of those seated nearest the table, though the windows remain shut. The candle's light trembles, not bending this time, but pulsing, expanding and shrinking in steady rhythm, as though breathing. The sound of the ticking clock grows louder, the gap between each tick stretching until it feels like the heartbeat of something vast, Mrs. Halbrook's lips move again, but no words come. The candle flame bends toward her face, touching the line of her jaw with faint light. The others sit motionless, waiting. The air feels close, compressed, yet alive. Something unseen breathes with them. Her body goes still once more. The guests lean forward, afraid to break the fragile silence. When she speaks again, her voice is faint, the words barely shaping themselves. "He remembers the fire," she says. "He remembers the smoke." Her tone changes, cracking slightly. "It burned before they woke." The tall man stares. "Who?" Mrs. Halbrook's hand lifts, trembling. "The ones in the house. The roof fell. He breathes their names even now." The candle flickers violently, wax spilling down its side. The flame splits, two tongues of light wavering in opposite directions before merging again. The smell of smoke deepens, thick and acrid. The maid coughs, waving her hand lightly through the air. "Madam, the candle." "Leave it," Mrs. Halbrook whispers. "It is his breath." The guests sit frozen as the light wavers, the shadow of the flame painting their faces in uneven strokes. For a moment, it seems as though the light itself hums, vibrating with faint sound. Then, as quickly as it began, the brightness fades, returning to its small, steady burn. Mrs. Halbrook inhales sharply. Her head tilts back, and she exhales with a sound like release. "He is gone," she says softly. The silence that follows feels deeper than before, the air hollowed by what has passed. The guests remain seated, their eyes on the candle that burns calmly once more. The sound beneath the table has stopped. The fog outside has thinned slightly, allowing the faintest outline of the gaslight to return through the glass. Mrs. Halbrook looks around the room slowly, her eyes weary but clear. "It is done," she says. "For now." No one answers. The night stretches on, the clock ticking toward midnight, and the flame burns low but unbroken. The séance parlor holds its silence, aware that what has spoken tonight will not easily fade when morning comes. The clock marks the slow passage of minutes beyond midnight, each strike softened by distance and the muffled calm of the fog outside. The air has cooled since the last candle burned low, but its faint scent lingers, mingled with the trace of wax and smoke that clings to the edges of the room. The guests remain seated, though their posture has softened, as if weariness has settled into their bones, but no one dares to rise. The faint reflection of the candle flame glows in the darkened glass of the window, and beyond it, the city lies asleep beneath a shifting veil of mist. Mrs. Halbrook has not spoken for some time. She sits with her hands folded neatly, her eyes open but unfocused, her breathing measured. There is something fragile in her stillness, a quiet thread of exhaustion running through it, yet the air around her feels watchful, alive. The maid stands by the wall again, her gaze fixed on the dying embers in the hearth, as though afraid to meet the shadows that hover beyond the table. The guests exchange brief, uncertain glances, but the hush of the room keeps their questions sealed behind their lips. A faint sound breaks the quiet. A tap, light and quick, from the edge of the table. Then another. The rhythm is small but deliberate, like the beginning of a pattern. The widower straightens, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. The tall man looks toward Mrs. Halbrook, but she does not move. The tapping continues, 3 in succession, then a pause, then again, softer, almost hesitant. The maid steps closer to the door, her face pale. Mrs. Halbrook's voice returns, quiet and even, but distant. "They are not gone," she says, "only waiting for permission to speak again." Her eyes drift toward the table. The faintest movement stirs upon its surface. A corner of parchment, yellowed with age, lifts slightly from the draughtless air. It has lain there since the beginning of the evening, blank, untouched, beside the slate and the bell. Now it shifts again, the edge curling upward as though drawn by unseen fingers. No one breathes. The chalk, resting beside it, moves once, rolling slightly before it stops. Then, without touch, it drags itself across the paper in a slow, uncertain line. The sound is faint, the dry scratch of chalk upon rough surface. But it fills the room with a weight that no one dares to interrupt. The line curves, lifts, curves again, forming the first hint of a letter. The widower leans forward, his voice a whisper. "Is it him again?" Mrs. Halbrook does not answer. Her eyes follow the movement, steady, unreadable. The chalk pauses, then continues. The shape grows clearer. An E, then a D, then a second D. The next stroke falters, trails off. The chalk rolls aside, as though dropped by an unseen hand. The widower exhales softly. "Edward," he murmurs, "my boy." The paper lies still, the faint marks visible in the dim light. Mrs. Halbrook nods once, barely perceptible. "He writes to you," she says, "not in ink, but in memory." The man covers his mouth with his hand, his eyes glistening. The others look on in silence, unsure whether to turn away or bear witness. The air has grown heavier again, thick with something that feels neither grief nor comfort, but both at once. Mrs. Halbrook reaches toward the table, her fingers hovering just above the page. "The dead learn our tools slowly," she says quietly. "Sometimes they borrow the living to finish what they begin." She lowers her hand, the tips of her fingers brushing the edge of the parchment. The moment she touches it, the chalk stirs again. It lifts slightly, steadies, then moves in short, jerking strokes, the letters forming one after another. DONTFORGET. The widower lets out a faint sound, part breath, part sob. "I never did," he says. "I never could." The chalk stops. The words on the page are faint, unsteady, some letters barely legible, but the message is clear. The maid turns away, blinking hard. The tall man, still pale, watches in silence. Mrs. Halbrook lifts her hand slowly, withdrawing it from the table. "He knows," she says. "They always know." The paper settles again, flat and still. The candle's light trembles over the uneven strokes, making them shimmer briefly before fading back into shadow. The air cools once more. The sense of presence recedes, though not completely. It lingers like breath after speech, like warmth after touch. The widower lowers his head, his shoulders trembling. The woman beside him lays a hand on his arm, silent. No one speaks. The quiet stretches long enough that the sound of the clock becomes a kind of pulse. Mrs. Halbrook exhales slowly. "There was a time," she says softly, "when they wrote with ink instead of air. When they used our hands instead of their own." The tall man glances at her. "You mean, through you?" She nods. "Or through any who listen deeply enough. Sometimes the hand moves before the thought arrives. They guide, not command." She looks down at the parchment again. The words upon it seem paler now, as though the paper itself has begun to swallow them. "Ink would have lasted longer," she murmurs, "but what they leave is not meant for permanence." From somewhere deep within the house, a soft sound echoes, a creak, slow and rhythmic, like footsteps pacing an unseen corridor. The guests turn their heads slightly, but no one rises. Mrs. Halbrook's gaze remains fixed upon the table. "They are restless tonight," she says. "When one speaks, the others remember they still can." The tall man rubs his temples, muttering under his breath. You make it sound like they're waiting in queue. They are, she says simply. The living forget that death is crowded. The silence that follows holds a strange kind of gravity. The faint crackle of the candle's wick punctuates it. Then, once again, the parchment stirs. This time, it does not lift, but slides slowly toward the edge of the table. The maid gasps softly, stepping forward as though to stop it, but Mrs. Halbrook raises a hand. "Let it move," she says. The paper drifts to the centre, stopping before the tall man. The chalk rolls once more, its motion sharp and decisive now. 3 short strokes, then 2 longer ones. The letters emerge. F-E-A-R. The chalk stops, then starts again. N-O-T. "Fear not," Mrs. Halbrook reads quietly. The tall man stares at the words, his lips parting slightly. "That's no child's message," he says. "No," she agrees. "Not all who speak tonight are children." The chalk rolls back to its resting place. The paper remains before him, its faint words soft beneath the candlelight. He stares at it, his jaw set, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something quieter, something like understanding. "Who are you?" he whispers. There's no sound, no knock, no voice. Only the faint movement of air, cool and slow, brushing his cheek like a passing breath. He flinches, his eyes darting toward the curtain. It hangs still. The maid moves closer to the wall again. The widower wipes his eyes with the edge of his sleeve. Mrs. Halbrook lowers her head slightly. "They know when to stop," she says. "They never linger when their words are heard." The tall man remains motionless. Then why does it feel like he's still here? "Because belief doesn't end when the sound does," she says. The clock ticks on. The faint scent of old paper fills the air. The candle's flame bends, straightens, and bends again. Outside, the fog has thinned enough that faint light from the nearest street lamp leaks through, painting a pale line across the rug. Mrs. Halbrook reaches for the paper once more, sliding it gently toward her. "Some messages," she says, "are meant for the living to carry forward." She folds it carefully, the creases neat, precise. "Would you wish to keep it?" The widower nods without hesitation. She passes it to him across the table. His fingers brush the edge of it with reverence, as though afraid it might dissolve at his touch. He holds it for a long moment before tucking it into his coat pocket. The maid exhales quietly. Doesn't that invite them to follow? Mrs. Halbrook looks up. They follow anyway. We are what they have left. The silence that follows feels different, less strained, almost tender. The weight of fear has lifted slightly, replaced by the calm ache of something nearer to grief. The guests shift in their chairs, the faint rustle of fabric filling the still air. Then, from the corner of the room, a new sound rises. Not a knock or scrape this time, but the faint, unmistakable rustle of paper. Every head turns. The noise comes from the small writing desk near the wall, half hidden behind the curtain. A single drawer slides open an inch, then stops. The sound of folded parchment inside shifts softly, as though stirred by breath. Mrs. Halbrook stands slowly, crossing the room with deliberate steps. She does not hurry, does not speak. The others watch her move through the dim light, her figure half shadowed by the candle. When she reaches the desk, she pauses, placing her hand lightly on the drawer. For a moment, she seems to listen. Then she pulls it open. Inside lie several sheets of old paper, their edges frayed and darkened with age. She lifts the first one carefully. The ink upon it has faded, but a few words remain legible. "From the sitting of November 3rd, she reads quietly. "He promised to return in a year's time." The widower's voice breaks the silence. "Did he?" Mrs. Halbrook turns the page slowly, her eyes scanning the faint lines. "No," she says, "but others did." She lays the paper flat on the desk, revealing beneath it several more, some blank, some marked with faint scrawls, initials, dates, single words like fragments of unfinished sentences. She closes the drawer softly, the sound of wood meeting wood barely audible. "These are from years before," she says. "Some return to the same rooms long after the living have forgotten. The paper keeps what memory cannot." She looks toward the table again, the single candle burning low, the shadows now long enough to reach the far wall. "They do not always find peace," she continues, "but they find voices who remember how to listen." The tall man rises quietly, moving toward the window. He parts the curtain slightly, just enough to glimpse the faint glow of the street beyond. The fog drifts like smoke, the lamps reduce to small, distant stars. "Do you ever tire of this?" he asks. Mrs. Halbrook's answer comes after a long pause. "I tire of pretending it ends," she says. "The world we leave is only the world we wait to be heard by." The maid crosses herself once more, her eyes downcast. The widower sits in silence, his hand resting over the folded paper in his coat. The other guests remain motionless, their faces lit by the last soft light of the candle. The flame flickers one final time, the wick bending forward before righting itself. The room grows quieter still, as if every sound now comes from very far away. Outside, the fog begins to thin, revealing the faint outlines of rooftops, the glint of wet cobblestones, the slow awakening of the city toward dawn. Inside, the paper lies where it was left, faint traces of chalk still visible across its surface. The words fade gradually as the light shifts, disappearing into the pale fibers of the page. The candle burns down to its base, leaving a small circle of smoke that drifts upward before dissolving into the air. No one moves to speak. The séance breathes in silence, the living and the dead momentarily equal in their stillness, each waiting for the other to speak again. The night continues its slow descent toward morning, and the parlor holds its quiet vigil, aware that the dead are never truly gone, only written differently. The house has settled into a different kind of quiet, the sort that follows a room full of people, learning the shape of their own breathing. The fog outside thins and thickens by turns, spreading and drawing back across the window like a slow tide. The candle has shortened to a stub and holds its flame with stubborn focus, its light tight and practical rather than grand. The embers in the grate carry a faint glow, but give no real heat, and the air smells of old ash, tallow, and a light trace of damp wool from coats that have not fully dried. The hour stands somewhere beyond midnight, not yet admitting to how close it has come to morning. Inside, every seat is occupied, and no one speaks because there is nothing to say that does not risk breaking what the room is holding. The tall man sits with his chair angled away from the table, as though he only happened to end up here and intends, at any point, to step into the hall and collect himself. His hat rests on his knee. One finger traces the edge of the brim in slow, even circles he does not seem to notice. His eyes are not restless now. They have settled into the kind of attention a person gives a bridge before crossing. He watches the candle, then the slate, then the curtain, then returns to the candle again, testing whether the world will stay the same while he looks away. Opposite him, the widower holds his coat closed with one hand and the folded paper with the other. He keeps his thumb pressed against the crease as if to make the words sink deeper into the fibers. The woman beside him has stopped trying to console him. She sits with her hands folded, the posture of someone who has learned that comfort can be a noise the grieved do not want to hear. Near the wall, the maid stands with her back straight and her eyes fixed on the line where the floor meets the skirting board. She moves only when the candle gutters and steadies again, the involuntary flinch of someone trained to anticipate tasks before they are asked. Mrs. Halbrook watches everything without appearing to move at all. The set of her shoulders is calm, the kind of calm that can only come from hours of conserving what is left. When she speaks, it is not to announce or instruct, but simply to let sound exist again. "You may change places if you wish," she says, and the sentence lands without demand. Hands can rest. No one moves at first. Then the tall man sets his hat on the floor and shifts forward, dragging his chair until it squares to the table. The legs scrape lightly. He places his hands flat, palms down, and studies the grain beneath his fingers, as if he expects to find a solution there. "I was educated to count only what can be weighed," he says, not looking up. "Measurements, proofs, things that stand the same, whether a man is sober or dreaming. I have chased men who sold tricks as miracles and found the wires every time." He breathes out through his nose, a sound more weary than scornful. "Tonight, every wire I looked for was not there. If there is a wire, it sits in me." The widower lifts his head. "Then stop pulling it," he answers. No anger in the words, only fatigue. Let the thing rest where it falls. The tall man glances at him. The candle puts a small, steady light into the hollows below his eyes. "If I stop pulling, I fear I will not look again," he says. "And I have a life built on looking." "You have a life built on never looking where it hurts," the widower replies, not unkindly. He rubs his thumb along the crease of the folded page. "He asked me not to forget, and I did not. That is not a trick. It is a job. I can do it without measuring anything." Mrs. Halbrook lets the exchange take its shape. She does not fill the space between the men. The clock on the mantel contributes a pulse without preference. The room holds. The tall man shifts his gaze to her. "If belief is what you ask for," he says, "say so plainly. I can't give what I don't have. I can give attention. I can give patience. I can give my best effort to be fair. Belief does not answer to effort. I ask for manners," she says. "Belief is not required." She turns one palm up, resting it lightly on the table. "You would not barge into a neighbour's kitchen and demand evidence for their hunger. You would sit and decide whether you had bread to share. The dead are neighbours with no house to knock." The maid crosses the room to the grate, picks up the small brush, and gathers the loose ash into a neater island. She works carefully to make no sound beyond the soft tap of bristles on stone. When she is done, she sets the brush down and steps back to the wall, her hands folded again. The tall man studies the maid as if her quiet has explained something better than any argument. "You believe?" he asks her. She looks at him because he has addressed her directly, and because her work has taught her that questions asked to servants are not always invitations, but sometimes tests. "I believe the dead don't like doors left open," she says. "I like a bolt on a night like this." He nods. It is not the answer he expected, and its plainness has the shape of truth. "And you?" he asks the widower. "I believe I was a father," the widower says. "That does not stop when a boy goes into the water. You asked what I believe. That is it." The tall man turns the brim of his hat in his hands and sets it neatly on the floor again. "I don't know what to do with what I saw," he says. "I will wait tomorrow and write no report because I will not yet trust my own eye. I will walk to my office through a city that does not care, and by noon I will have invented a version of tonight in which I remain fixed, and everything moves around me. It will be a coward's invention, and it will let me work. Mrs. Halbrook lifts the candle stub and settles it a fraction to the left. The flame wakes from its slight lean and stands more centered. "Then you already know which story is true," she says. He looks down at the table. His hand lies there like a tool waiting to be used. After a moment, he places the other hand beside it. "Give me a rule," he says. "Not a principle, a rule. Something small I can do without lying to myself." She thinks not long. "Do not decide," she says. "Ask. If a thing startles you, ask it to try again slower. If it refuses, do not chase it. If it returns, watch without reaching. If you cannot watch without reaching, take your hands off the table. Do not pretend calm you do not have. Calm that is faked will break the room." He nods once. "That I can do." The widower's mouth tightens and eases. "Ask slowly," he says to the tall man. He answered slowly. The tall man's eyes move to the folded paper. His gaze does not try to read it. He looks at it as a fact arranged on the surface of a world that has had enough of changing for one night. "I have accused men of cruelty for less than what I said tonight," he adds, mostly to the air. "I'd like to ask the room to consider me as if I didn't say it." "The room does not keep minutes," Mrs. Halbrook says. "It keeps breath." A small sound rises from the hall, the quiet click of a latch settling in an old door frame. As the house shifts, the maid lifts her head but stays where she is. The tall man doesn't flinch. He seems to have found a method for not requiring every sound to declare an allegiance. "Tell me something I am permitted not to believe," he says, looking at Mrs. Halbrook again, "and still stay." "You are permitted not to believe that the hand which wrote on that page was separate from your own kind," she says. "You are permitted to believe that memory wrote in chalk and you watched it happen. You are permitted to call what we share here an agreement rather than a visitation. If those permissions keep you at the table, they are good manners." "And the line I may not cross?" he asks. "Mockery," she says. "It drives away the shy. The ones who shout will shout somewhere else, but the shy, if they go, the room will turn thin and not useful." "I won't mock," he says, and his voice is level. The widower folds the paper once more, slower this time, not to hide it, but to know where it is by feel. "He was never noisy," he says, almost to himself. "He waited to be called for supper." The tall man hears the story behind the sentence and decides, wisely, not to ask for more. He looks toward the window because it is the only place left to look that is not a person. The fog has loosened its hold. The faint pattern of the sash is visible, and beyond it a softened square of street lamp shows a small patch of pavement, as if the city has drawn a careful line around one safe thing. Mrs. Halbrook lowers her hand until her fingertips rest on the table without weight. The gesture is not a signal. It is an announcement to her own body that the evening has ground left to cover. "When I began," she says, "I thought you had to choose. One room for the living, one for the dead, a corridor between. I learned that the corridor is the room. We spend our lives in it and pretend it has walls." She does not raise her voice. It is a sentence meant to sit, not to persuade. The tall man breathes and looks down at his hands. He flexes his fingers and sets them flat again. "If the corridor is the room," he says, "then the trick is not to run." He glances at the widower. "I have done a lifetime of running." "Then take a chair," the widower says. No one smiles at the line. There is nothing comic in it. But the sentence arranges something in the air like a piece of furniture moved into its right place. From the desk near the curtain, A drawer loosens in its track and recedes again, the simple settling of wood. No one mistakes it for more than it is. The room, for a moment, is only a room. The maid clears her throat softly. "Would you like tea?" she asks, addressing the air rather than any single guest. Something to hold. It is a practical suggestion. The idea of a warm cup travelling the circle like a small, steady lantern is plain and sensible. Mrs. Halbrook nods and the maid slips out. The hall swallows the small sound of her steps. The house takes the absence into its quiet without complaint. The tall man shifts and then stills, catching himself before the chair legs scrape. "When I was in school," he says to the table, "we were taught to separate the seeing from the saying. First see, then say. We were told that error creeps in through the mouth. Tonight I saw before I knew how to say. Then I said too soon and could no longer see. I do not want to lose the sight again." "Then do not hurry," Mrs. Halbrook says. "This night is not a stage you will be asked to remember by morning. It will remember you before you remember it." The widower nods once, a small agreement. "He asked me not to forget," he says. "That is not a demand to keep a candle lit forever. It is a direction to live as if he might pass by, and I would like the lamp to be ready if he does." The maid returns with a tray. The cups are sturdy, the kind that can be held without worry. Steam carries a clean smell that stands opposite to smoke. She sets the tray on the side table and passes the cups without clink or spill. The tall man accepts his as if someone has placed weight into his hands that is finally appropriate to the hour. The widower wraps both hands around his and lets the heat decide the shape of his fingers. Mrs. Halbrook does not drink at once. She watches the column of steam and, for a moment, lets her eyes follow it as if it is a road drawn upward and away. The tea sets a kind of boundary the room has been missing. It makes sense to lift a cup at the same time another does. It makes sense to set a cup down when the table has gone quiet and a second cup touches the saucer. It makes sense to refill when someone nods. The living reclaim a small competence, and it steadies them. The tall man drinks and sets his cup down squarely on the saucer. "I have questions that could fill a book," he says. "Names, dates, references, the kind of inquiry I can carry to a colleague without being laughed out of the room. I will not ask them now because they are not the kind that belong after midnight." "Ask one that does belong," the widower says. The tall man thinks. He does not look up for permission. "When this is done, will it follow me home?" he asks. "Not the boy or the letters. The sense that the world has seams I did not know about." "It already has," Mrs. Halbrook says. "You are asking the question." He nods. "Then tell me what to do when the seam shows in the middle of the day." "Do not pull it open in front of people who need the cloth to hold," she says. "Step into a doorway or find a bench and let the seam sit beside you like a person. If it asks for your attention, give it quietly. If you cannot, mark the place on the street with your eye and return there later. Stones remember where they were asked to keep a seat." "That is superstitious," he says, and the word has no sting. "It is orderly," she answers. Order is what superstition wishes it could be. He takes another drink. The cup warms his mouth and he sighs without meaning to. "You speak as if the dead prefer courtesy to devotion." "They do," she says. "Devotion is a speech about the speaker. Courtesy is a chair pulled out for the listener." The widower's eyes settle back on the folded paper. "He was shy," he says, and the sentence is enough to build a person out of. He slides the paper deeper into his pocket, not to hide it, but to give it a safer wall. The maid collects the empty cups as quietly as she set them down. She pauses with the tall man's cup and waits. He looks at it and shakes his head once. She leaves it where it is. He is not ready to surrender what he has learned to hold. The room tightens again, not with fear, but purpose. The night has another bend in it, and the furniture seems to know. The clock measures something that does not belong to measurement. A noise rises beneath the table. It is not the loud rap that requires flinching. It is the small, patient sound of someone tapping to see if the door is still latched. The tall man looks at Mrs. Halbrook. She does not move, so he does not either. The widower keeps his eyes on his hands. The maid takes one step back so that the wall will hold her weight if her knees decide to be unreliable. The tapping repeats, then pauses. The candle does not bend this time. It holds its shape and burns straight. The sound comes a third time, and the tall man follows his rule. He does not decide. He asks, "If you want us to listen," he says, level and slow, "try once more at half the strength." The taps come again, softer. The table shivers, a motion small enough to be doubt and large enough to be purpose. He does not reach for the underside. He does not check the legs. He does not smile. He simply watches. "Thank you," he says. And it is not an experimenter's thank you, but something more ordinary. The sort of thank you one gives to a child who has learned to knock before entering. The sound stops. A long breath moves around the circle without belonging to a single chest. The room eases. The widower clears his throat. "He learned his letters late," he says, with the careful pride of a man who has rehearsed the story enough times to keep the ending from breaking him. He would sit at the table and press too hard until the chalk snapped. Then he would look at me like the world had asked too much of him for a moment, and in a moment would be fine. The tall man answers with something simple. "I heard him," he says. "The sound of the chalk made sense tonight." He picks up his cup and drinks, and when he sets it down, his hands are steadier than they were an hour ago. Mrs. Halbrook looks toward the covered mirror on the wall. The cloth hangs straight, the pinned corners neat. "We used to remove that cloth," she says, "to see who stood behind us. We learned to keep it there. The living are better served by knowing who sits beside them." The maid nods once, a short, firm motion that has no ornament on it. The practice suits her. She trusts a room that asks for the next task and not the next proof. The tall man turns his head and studies the covered mirror as if cataloguing every crease is a way to remember the instruction not to lift the cloth. "I will leave it when I go home," he says, surprising himself with how quickly a rule can become a plan. "In the morning, I will be tempted to look. I will not." "You may look when the sun is in the room," Mrs. Halbrook says. "Mirrors prefer the day." The clock marks an even hour. The sound is full but not heavy. The city outside answers with nothing at all, the simplest courtesy a street can offer. Far off, a cartwheel hits a loose stone, then continues. Somewhere a dog tests the air and decides there is nothing worth complaint. The table remains quiet. The house has decided to behave as a house. The séance is not finished, but it has changed its footing. The living have done as much work as the dead for the time being. The tall man lifts his hat from the floor and does not put it on. He holds it against his chest, like a man taking air after a swim. "If I come again," he says to no one in particular, "will the room remember me?" "The room remembers how you sat," Mrs. Halbrook says. "It remembers whether you left the chair quietly and whether you folded the blanket. It remembers the way your hands learned not to reach." He looks at his hands, aware of them in a new way. Then I will give it something easier to remember next time. He replaces the hat on his knee. I am not a believer, he adds, almost apologizing, but I am less of a liar than I was when I walked in. That is a fair trade, the widower says. A faint draught finds the bottom of the door and retreats. The maid crosses the floor and sets her palm near the gap to test if it will trouble the candle. It does not. She wipes her hand against her apron and returns to her post. The tall man sits back and lets his shoulders settle. He is not a different person. He is a person who understands that the ground is not always where he left it. He is not at peace, but peace has a place to step toward him if it chooses. The widower tucks the paper deeper into his coat and smooths the lapel with a careful stroke, as if the act could keep the message warm. He does not look at anyone when he speaks. If a man goes home and the house is quiet and the knight asks him a question he cannot answer, he should answer with a small thing he can do. I will put a cup on the table. I will fold a napkin. I will light a lamp and stop before the room is bright. That is the kind of answer I can keep giving. The tall man nods and repeats it for himself, the way a student repeats a sentence that will be on the examination of his real life. A cup, a napkin, a lamp. He lets the list sit on his tongue. It is not grand enough to frighten him and not trivial enough to let him off. Mrs. Halbrook lowers her gaze to the candle. The stub is nearly done. She does not move to snuff it. She lets it work until it chooses to end. Someone in another house is asking the same question in a different shape, she says, almost a thought more than a statement. They will give the same kind of answer if they are lucky. The room accepts that there are other rooms. The city is large, and the knight has plenty of work to do before the milk carts begin to roll. The fog has loosened and gathers now in corners instead of swallowing streets. The lamps outside draw small round boundaries that a pedestrian can trust. The river carries a faint smell up through the quiet, the honest smell of wet stone and iron. The world prepares without hurry to be ordinary again. The tall man looks at the window and then at the door. He does not stand. He understands that leaving is not what the room is doing, and he does not want to be the person who shifts its weight too soon. He sits and lets his breath find the rhythm the house has chosen. The widower closes his eyes and opens them. The woman beside him rests her hand on his sleeve and leaves it there rather than patting, which would be less helpful. The maid straightens a chair no one is using, because a thing can be made kind simply by facing it the way it will be needed later. The candle shortens. The wick folds inward on itself and then finds a way to stand again. The flame agrees to continue. The room waits. It is enough for now that two men who would not have chosen to be neighbours have learned, if only for an hour, to keep the same quiet without turning it into an argument. A small noise touches the underside of the table, nothing more than a fingertip testing whether the door is still politely shut. The tall man feels the urge to explain the sound into something easy and lets the urge pass like a cough he has decided to swallow. The widower hears the same sound and decides it does not require him. Mrs. Halbrook feels it and counts to 3 without moving, and the maid hears it and checks the candle without touching it. No one announces what they have learned, because announcing would force the lesson to stand on legs not ready for walking. The night gives them the courtesy of time. The city gives them the courtesy of silence. The room gives them chairs that do not creak when a person changes his mind and decides to sit a little longer. When the knock does not come again, no one is disappointed. And when the clock moves its hands and the hour advances by a notch, no one is surprised. It is only the work of being present, and tonight the that work has been enough to turn a skeptic into a person who does not need to call himself one, and a believer into a person who does not need to prove it. The candle keeps its light. The walls keep their place. The door keeps its latch. And beyond the glass, the fog keeps company with the lamps, as if the city has agreed that for a little while longer it will let the living carry what they have learned without asking them to decide what it is. The candle burns so low now that its flame trembles against its own reflection in the brass holder, small and thin and determined. The air around it feels cooled by the hour, touched with that faint mineral scent that comes only when night has thickened past its middle. The guests remain seated in the same quiet circle. The teacups have been cleared, the saucers stacked neatly on the sideboard. Every sound that belongs to ordinary life has finished its work. The clock ticks with a measured calm, no longer counting, but keeping watch. Mrs. Halbrook looks toward the window once, then lowers her gaze. Her eyes have grown darker, her posture still exact. The room carries the soft fatigue of long wakefulness, that sense of being caught between two worlds, one that waits to sleep, one that waits to stir. The maid stands beside the hearth again, her hands folded before her, her expression fixed but alert. The widower sits slightly back from the table now, his coat pulled close, his eyes half closed. The tall man watches him, then the floor, then the candle. No one speaks. When Mrs. Halbrook finally does, her voice comes low, steady, the edges smoothed by long habit. "Before the night changes again," she says, "the room must be sealed." The tall man lifts his head, not in protest, but in simple acknowledgement. The widower opens his eyes. The maid straightens. Mrs. Halbrook reaches into the small drawer of the sideboard and takes from it a shallow tin box. She opens it carefully. Inside lies a mixture of coarse salt and dried herbs, their scent faint but sharp. Rosemary, bay, something bitter like sage. She sets the box on the table and rests her hand upon it for a moment, as though weighing its worth. "This is not for the dead," she says. "It is for the living. The dead do not need walls. We do." The maid crosses to her and waits. Mrs. Halbrook hands her the small pewter spoon that lies within the box. "Begin with the corners," she says. The maid nods once, then moves quietly through the room. She stoops to touch the spoon to each corner, sprinkling a thin line of salt along the boards, each motion careful and even. The sound of the grains falling is almost too soft to hear, but the rhythm carries through the stillness like a steady breath. The scent of the herbs rises faintly with the motion, drifting through the cool air until the parlor smells faintly of the garden after rain. Mrs. Halbrook watches her, saying nothing. When the maid finishes the fourth corner, she returns to the table and sets the spoon back into the box. Mrs. Halbrook closes the lid gently and slides it aside. "Now," she says, "each of you will touch the flame once with care and pass it on." The widower hesitates, then reaches out, his hand hovering above the candle. He does not touch the fire itself, only holds his fingers close enough that the heat finds him. His face softens in the light. When he draws back, he nods slightly and looks to the woman beside him. She does the same, and so the circle continues, each person pausing for the briefest moment to feel the warmth and then withdraw. When it reaches the tall man, he hesitates longer than the rest. The light shimmers in his eyes, the reflection trembling slightly. He places his hand near the flame and leaves it there until the heat stings. Then he withdraws and says nothing. Mrs. Halbrook waits until the candle is steady again, then takes the bell in her hand. She holds it low, the clapper resting against the rim. Her voice lowers further. "There are 3 calls," she says. One to close the door, one to still the air, one to mark the living. She lifts the bell and rings it once. The sound is bright but soft, not shrill, just a single clear note that lingers longer than seems possible before fading into silence. The air responds with a faint shift, as if the house has heard its name and stilled itself in answer. The second ring follows. The tone deepens slightly, the vibration carrying through the table, up through the floorboards, into the walls. The flame flickers once and straightens. The widower glances toward the window, but the fog outside remains still. The third ring is quieter than the others, the sound rounding off before it finishes, a note swallowed by distance. When it ends, the silence that follows feels cleaner somehow, like a floor newly swept. Mrs. Halbrook sets the bell down and folds her hands once more. "It is not the noise that matters," she says. "It is the intent. Sound is only the body of intention." The tall man studies her. "And this keeps them out?" "It keeps us in," she says. "The distinction is the same." The maid returns to her post. The faint scent of the herbs still lingers, sharper now as the air warms slightly around the candle. The room feels different, not lighter, but defined. Its edges have returned. The widower clears his throat softly. "My grandmother used to scatter salt along the sill on All Hallows Night," he says. "Said it stopped the wandering souls from leaning too close to the glass." Mrs. Halbrook nods once. "Every house had its ways," she says. "Iron nails in the lintel, bread in the pocket, water by the door for the thirsty dead. The living forgot the purpose, but kept the gesture." The tall man rubs his thumb along the edge of his cup. "You make it sound like a language," he says. "It is," she replies. "The dead understand order. They do not mistake respect for invitation." The maid glances toward the mirror, still veiled beneath the heavy cloth. The faint outline of her own reflection moves behind the fabric, like a shadow remembering itself. She turns her eyes away. "And the mirrors?" she asks. Mrs. Halbrook answers without looking. "They are mouths. Leave them covered until morning." The clock ticks on. Its face gleams faintly in the candlelight, the brass rim catching small reflections like eyes half shut. Outside, the fog presses against the window again, softer now, a slow breathing rather than a shroud. Mrs. Halbrook reaches once more into the drawer and draws out a thin piece of chalk, worn short from use. She breaks the end to sharpen it, then leans forward to mark the table's underside. The sound of chalk on wood is faint but certain. A single straight line, then a cross over it. She draws 3 of these, evenly spaced. 3 marks, she says quietly. Not for luck, but for limit. The widower watches her hand. What happens if we don't? She pauses, sets the chalk aside and looks at him. Nothing, she says. That is the trouble. Nothing happens until it does. The tall man exhales through his nose, the sound carrying a trace of uneasy amusement. I suppose that is comfort of a kind. Comfort is a choice, she says. Protection is practice. The words settle without echo. The table gleams faintly in the dim light, the chalk marks hidden beneath, but present. From somewhere behind the wall, a faint creak rises, then stops. No one moves. The maid looks toward the sound, her eyes wide but steady. Mrs. Halbrook tilts her head slightly, listening. It passes, she says. The creak does not return. The widower leans forward, elbows on the table. In my village, he says after a moment, they used to hang rowan branches above the door on the 1st of November. Red berries for the living, green leaves for the souls on their way. My mother would say the berries were eyes, watching for what didn't belong. Mrs. Halbrook gives a faint smile. The colour keeps them from forgetting where the world begins. The tall man runs a hand along the edge of the table. "You make it sound almost reasonable," he says. "It is reasonable," she replies. "The dead prefer clarity." He nods slowly. "And what if they want to stay?" She looks at him. "Then we make them welcome, but not comfortable." The fire in the grate gives a soft pop, startling no one. A small ember stirs, glows, and dies. The faint smell of burnt wood rises, mixing with the scent of herbs and smoke. The air feels warm again, but not gentle, like a room aware of its own boundaries. Mrs. Halbrook lifts her eyes toward the ceiling. "There are layers above and below," she says. "Each holds its own quiet. We sit between them and call it life." The tall man listens without speaking. The widower closes his eyes again. The maid's hands tighten briefly around her apron and then loosen. The candle guttered once more, the flame pulling low, then standing tall again. Its light strikes the brass rim of the bell and turns it to a small circle of gold. The shadows on the walls shift, but not restlessly, just enough to remind the living that they are still visible. Mrs. Halbrook folds her hands together. "The house is settled now," she says. "What waits outside can wait until morning." The tall man glances toward the door. "And if morning doesn't come?" "It always comes," she says, "whether or not we see it." Her tone carries no mystery, no threat, only the simple assurance of someone who has watched too many nights to expect anything else. The widower looks at the folded paper in his coat pocket, his thumb tracing the edge through the fabric. The thought of his son's message seems smaller now, but not less real. The words belong to the night, but their weight has become his to keep. Mrs. Halbrook rises slowly, the motion careful, measured. She carries the small box of salt to the mantel and sets it there beside the clock. Then she lifts one of the half-burned candles from the sideboard and lights it from the remaining flame. The two flames meet, bend, and part. She places the new candle near the window. Its light touches the glass and stops, unable to pass through. She turns back to the table. "There," she says, "that keeps the threshold clear." The tall man watches the light. "A guard. A reminder," she says, "that there is still a line." The maid moves toward the door and slides the bolt into place. The sound is clean, metallic, final, without being harsh. She steps back, dusts her hands on her apron, and nods once. The house breathes differently now. The creaks have stopped, the walls settled. Even the faint draft that had haunted the floorboards seems to have withdrawn. The silence that follows is not emptiness, it is containment. Mrs. Halbrook returns to her seat. The others follow her example. The candle by the window flickers but holds. The flame on the table burns smaller, steadier, its light centered on the circle of faces. "This is how they used to end their nights," she says quietly. "With small tasks. Water on the sill, ash in the hearth, a prayer that mentions no names. It wasn't fear that made them do it. It was the knowing." The tall man's gaze stays on the candle. "Knowing what?" "That the world is larger than its noise," she says. "That something watches even when it means no harm." The widower nods faintly, eyes half closed. "My mother said the same," he murmurs. "She'd stir the ashes before bed, so no spirit found a cold hearth." "Exactly that," she says. "A kindness that costs nothing." The clock ticks on. The fog outside drifts slower now, its pale light barely visible through the thick glass. Somewhere far away, a church bell marks another hour. The sound reaches them faintly, softened by distance and mist. Inside, the air holds steady. The faint smell of salt and herbs remains. The flame burns lower but does not fade. The room stands firm in its own quiet, its edges drawn and kept. And though none of them speak it aloud, each knows that the rituals were never about keeping the dead away, but about reminding the living to stay where they are. The line between worlds is thin, but it is still a line, and it holds for those who remember to draw it. The silence lengthens, but it is not uneasy. It is the stillness of something preserved. The table stands unshaken, the marks beneath it unseen but present, the salt unmoved in its corners, the door locked with quiet purpose. The night, for now, stays where it belongs. Outside, the fog presses once more against the window, then drifts away. The candle holds its flame. The house keeps its watch. And in the small circle of light, the living remember, without saying so, that safety is not the absence of fear, but the care of boundaries kept. The fog presses closer to the glass again, drawn inward by the faint difference between the warmth of the parlor and the long chill of the street beyond. The candle by the window flickers once, its reflection momentarily splitting in the pane before rejoining itself. The air inside feels heavier, though nothing has changed. No draft, no whisper, no movement that can be named. The salt still lies in its corners, the herbs still scent the air, and the line of chalk beneath the table has not shifted. Yet the weight of the night feels altered, as if something beyond the wall has paused and turned its gaze toward the light. Mrs. Halbrook sits with her hands folded in her lap again, her posture perfect, her eyes open but calm. The others have grown quiet in a new way, not the quiet of uncertainty, but the stillness of people who sense that listening might matter more than speech. The tall man stares at the flame on the table, its tip trembling as though pulled by breath. The widower rests both hands over the pocket that holds the folded message, his fingers motionless. The maid remains by the door, alert, her face pale but composed. The sound outside is faint at first, a low murmur somewhere between air and movement. It comes and goes, uncertain, like footsteps half imagined. No rhythm, no direction, just the faintest suggestion that something drifts past the window and then returns. The tall man tilts his head, listening without realizing it. The maid's eyes move toward the sound, but stop short of the curtain. "It is not the wind," Mrs. Halbrook says quietly, without being asked. "It is the watchers." The tall man's voice is low. "You mean people?" "No," she says, her tone even. "Not people." The words hang for a moment, and then the sound outside deepens slightly. It is not louder, only closer. The fog glows faintly where it touches the window, brightened by the reflection of the candlelight. For a moment it seems to pulse, drawing in and out like the slow breath of something that waits. The widower looks up. "What do they want?" "Nothing," Mrs. Halbrook says. "They have forgotten wanting. They come only to look." The maid's voice is small, careful. "At us? At the living," she says. They are drawn to where warmth collects. The sound against the glass shifts again, a long, slow movement like fabric sliding over stone. The fog outside thickens until the world beyond has vanished entirely. Only the faint, blurred halo of a distant gaslight remains, flickering like a memory behind gauze. The air in the room tightens. The tall man sits forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the window. "You've seen them before," he says. "Yes," Mrs. Halbrook replies. "Every year, when the light in the city thins and the air begins to hold its breath. They walk the edges of streets and the corners of rooms. tracing what they once knew. Some recognize their homes, some only sense the warmth behind glass. And they can't come in. They can, she says, but not easily. The line must weaken first. His eyes move toward the candle by the window. That line? She nods faintly. That and the salt, and the stillness. They do not enter where order holds. The maid steps forward, voice soft. Then we must stay still. Mrs. Halbrook's gaze shifts to her. Exactly so. The sound outside moves again, slower now. It drifts along the length of the window, pausing near the center. The faint outline of a hand appears for a heartbeat. No shape, no detail, just a slight darkening in the fog, as though pressure has changed the light. Then it fades. The widower presses a hand against his chest, the other gripping the edge of the table. He said they were cold, he murmurs. In his letter. Mrs. Halbrook's eyes remain on the window. They are not cold, she says. They remember what warmth felt like, but they cannot hold it. They press close to what they've lost. The tall man's hand trembles once before he steadies it against his thigh. And if we acknowledge them, then they stay longer, she says. The fog thickens again. The reflection of the candle breaks apart, scattered by the moving surface. It looks for an instant as if faces flicker within it. No clear features, only the faint impressions of form, too quick to name. The maid steps back until her shoulders touch the wall. The tall man does not move. The widower closes his eyes and lowers his head. Mrs. Halbrook does not look away. Her voice, when she speaks again, is quiet but sure. They gather where memory gathers. This house remembers too much. The tall man's tone is measured, half skepticism, half surrender. And yet you keep opening the door for them. I keep it open, she says, because it will open anyway. Better to meet what comes with a light than with fear. The sound against the glass stops. The fog remains thick, but still. The candle at the window flickers once, then steadies. The silence that follows is long enough to make the guests aware of every sound within the room. The faint crack of cooling wood, the whisper of breath, the slow beat of the clock. The widower raises his head. Are they gone? Mrs. Halbrook exhales softly. Not gone, she says. They never are, but they have turned away. The tall man leans back slightly, though his gaze does not leave the window. Do they know we see them? Some do, she says. Those who are seen often in life. The forgotten rarely notice the living at all. They pass through as if through mist. The maid lowers her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. It's cruel. It is the way of it, Mrs. Halbrook answers. We do not vanish when we die. We become what others fail to remember. The tall man rubs his temple. Then forgetting is the second death. It is the quieter one, she says. The words settle like dust in the air. The fog outside shifts again, slower this time, drifting upward along the pane until the faint glow of the street lamp returns, blurred but visible. The shapes within it dissolve, leaving only the dull, pale light. Mrs. Halbrook reaches for the box of salt again, lifting the lid with care. She takes a small pinch between her fingers and drops it into the flame of the nearest candle. The salt crackles softly, the flame flaring bright for an instant before settling back to its steady glow. Every flame hungers, she says. Salt reminds it to stay. The widower nods, eyes following the brief flare. My wife used to say the same, he murmurs. She'd scatter salt when the wind changed, said it kept the night from wandering into the room. Mrs. Halbrook replaces the lid and sets the box down. She was right, she says. It keeps the watchers outside. The tall man glances toward the door. And if the line weakens? Then the watchers come closer, she says. They stand at the threshold and wait for the living to speak first. And if we don't? They whisper, she says simply. A faint sound drifts through the wall then, not from outside, but from somewhere deep within the house. It is soft, almost delicate, the barest suggestion of a voice not meant for human hearing. A single syllable, stretched and distant, more vibration than sound. It comes once and fades. The tall man's eyes dart toward the ceiling. The maid grips the edge of the mantel. The widower sits motionless, his breath caught halfway. Mrs. Halbrook's voice remains calm. They have heard us, she says, but they will not come in. The circle holds. The silence returns. Slowly, the tension in the room begins to ease, though no one relaxes fully. The air feels lighter now, the edges of the room clearer. The faint scent of the herbs has deepened, masking the musty smell of the old wood. The tall man lets out a slow breath. You live with this often? Always, she says. It is quieter in summer, but they never leave entirely. Do you ever sleep? When I can, she replies. The living must rest, even when the dead will not. The clock strikes once, marking the half hour. The sound echoes softly through the parlor and dies against the curtains. Outside, the fog begins to thin, the outlines of nearby roofs emerging faintly through the pale haze. The widower stands slowly, the movement deliberate. He's not out there, he says. I can feel it. Mrs. Halbrook looks up at him. No, she says. He has gone where he was meant to go. The tall man remains seated, staring at the candle. And the others? They will wait for the next light, she says. Or another house. The maid moves toward the window, stopping just short of the curtain. She lifts a hand, but does not touch it. It looks thinner now, she says. It always does near dawn, Mrs. Halbrook answers. The maid lowers her hand. Then we've done enough. Mrs. Halbrook nods. For tonight. The fog outside shifts one last time, rising in small curls before dissolving into the air. The faint sound of hooves on cobblestone reaches them from somewhere down the street, followed by the soft creak of a cartwheel. Life, distant but real, begins to stir beyond the wall. Mrs. Halbrook glances toward the window. The reflection of the candle flame now shows more clearly, no longer lost in the grey light. The circle of warmth within the room holds, surrounded but untouched by what lies beyond. The tall man finally rises, stretching his hands once before letting them fall to his sides. His voice is quiet. Then the watchers go. For now, she says. The widower looks at the folded page in his coat, his fingers brushing the pocket once more. Then we stay. Yes, she says. That is what the living do. The words find no echo, but they do not need one. The candle burns steady, the salt remains unbroken in the corners, and the fog outside drifts away from the window at last. The watchers have passed, leaving only the faint trace of their presence in the silence they leave behind. Inside, the air feels clear again, lighter, as if the room itself exhales. The night continues, quieter now, the threshold intact, the line between worlds drawn firm once more. The city begins to shift toward waking, unseen but inevitable. But within this small house, the living remain where they are, their breaths slow and even, their hands still. The fog moves on, and the watchers fade with it, leaving the candlelight unbroken, the room unmarked, and the silence, this time, belonging entirely to the living. The room has begun to pale at the edges, not from any true daylight yet, but from the softest thinning of the dark, That moment before dawn, when colour exists only as memory. The fog outside still drifts against the glass, but it has loosened its hold. A thin film of moisture traces slow paths down the window pane, catching what little light there is and turning it into silver threads. The candle at the table burns low, its wick bent slightly, its pool of wax trembling each time someone exhales too close. No one has spoken for a long while. The house has reached that strange stillness that comes only at the end of long nights, when even silence has grown tired of itself. The widower sits forward again, his hands resting on the table, the folded page still hidden in his coat. His expression has softened. The deep lines of grief have not disappeared, but they have settled into something quieter, something lived with, rather than fought. The tall man sits opposite him, no longer tense, his shoulders rounded by weariness. He has stopped watching the candle. His gaze wanders instead, first to the window, then to the salt along the floor, then back to the unlit corner of the room where the chalkboard leans against the wall, half-shadowed, waiting. The maid stands near the hearth, her arms crossed loosely now, her posture less rigid, though her eyes remain fixed on Mrs. Halbrook. Mrs. Halbrook herself looks unchanged. She sits straight, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes reflecting the last light of the flame. Her face carries the same unreadable calm it always has, though something in her stillness suggests effort. She seems to listen not just to the room, but to something beyond it, a frequency no one else can quite catch. Finally, she speaks. "We have come to the end of the night," she says softly, "but the night is not done with us." The tall man looks up. "Then we must finish it." She inclines her head slightly. "It will finish itself, but we must give it form." She reaches for the slate resting beside her and places it in the center of the table. The chalk beside it is worn to a stub. She picks it up, holds it between her fingers, and then sets it down again without writing. "The last sitting is for quiet," she says. "No calling, no asking, only answering." The widower's brow furrows faintly. "Answering whom?" "Whoever still listens," she says. The tall man's voice is dry, though not unkind. "And if no one does, then we speak for them," she replies. The words seem to calm him. He leans back slightly and folds his hands together. The maid steps forward, careful not to disturb the circle, and adds another pinch of salt to the flame. It flares briefly, then steadies again. Mrs. Halbrook closes her eyes. "No sound for a while," she says. "Let the house remember." The silence that follows is dense but not heavy. It feels alive, pulsing faintly with each slow breath. The faint ticking of the clock marks the moments with soft precision. Somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard contracts with the change in temperature. Outside, a cart passes slowly through the fog, its wheels echoing against wet stone before fading into distance. Inside, the air feels contained, perfectly balanced between stillness and presence. The tall man keeps his gaze fixed on the slate. The widower lowers his head slightly, his eyes half shut. The maid steps back into the shadows, her hands clasped before her. Mrs. Halbrook remains perfectly still. The silence stretches longer. Then faintly, the slate moves. Only a fraction of an inch, a small shift on the table's surface. The movement is deliberate, not caused by vibration or draft. The widower's eyes open. The tall man straightens slightly. No one speaks. The chalk trembles once, rolls a short distance, and stops. Mrs. Halbrook's lips move, though her voice is barely audible. "Let them finish." The chalk begins to move again, dragging across the slate in uneven strokes. The sound is dry and faint, but clear. One letter appears, then another. The line pauses, continues, falters, then straightens. It forms a single word, uneven but legible. Wait. The widower exhales softly, his eyes locked on the slate. For what? He whispers. The chalk shifts again, slower now. The strokes are weaker, fading. 2 more letters appear. Dawn. Then it stops. Mrs. Halbrook opens her eyes. They ask for witness, she says. They want to be seen leaving. The tall man glances toward the window. The fog there has begun to pale slightly, the faintest hint of light showing through. The horizon is still lost, but the dark is no longer complete. Then we wait, he says. They do. The clock ticks on. The candle burns lower still. The air cools slightly, enough that the maid moves to the hearth and kneels to stir the embers. The faint crackle of rekindled fire breaks the silence, but softly, like something returning to life. She feeds it 2 small pieces of coal, just enough to keep it breathing. The glow spreads gently across the grate, casting thin light on the wall. Mrs. Halbrook's eyes follow the flame. That will do, she says. The tall man looks down at the slate again. The word remains, wait, its chalk dust fine and powdery at the edges. It's strange, he says quietly. We fear what comes in the dark, but it's the leaving that unsettles most. They do not fear leaving, Mrs. Halbrook says, only being forgotten as they go. He nods once. And you, do you remember them all? As many as I can, she says. Memory is the only door that stays open both ways. The fog outside shifts again. Through the thinning haze, the faint outline of rooftops becomes visible, sharp at their edges, wet with dew. The faintest sound of a bird reaches them, a single note, uncertain, almost swallowed by distance. The widower looks toward the window, his voice low. That will be the first one, he says. Mrs. Halbrook nods. They hear it too. The chalk on the table moves once more, barely perceptible this time, as though stirred by air. It drags a single faint line across the slate, not enough to form a letter, just a motion, like a wave goodbye. The tall man sees it. They're finished, he says. Yes, she replies. The watchers have gone, and those who spoke with them follow after. The maid steps closer to the table. Then what remains? Only what was ours already, Mrs. Halbrook says. She reaches out and touches the chalk with the tip of one finger. The movement is slow, deliberate. The chalk breaks cleanly in 2. The sound is sharp but small, final without flourish. She places the halves beside the slate and folds her hands. Outside, the fog lifts further. A strip of pale grey light runs along the edge of the window, enough to dim the candle's glow. The flame bends, then steadies, then begins to shorten as the wax gives way. The widower watches it. Will they return next year? He asks. If we're still here, she says. And if we're not? Then others will wait in our place. The tall man rubs his thumb along the table's edge. You make it sound endless. It is, she says, but it doesn't belong to us to end. The maid glances toward the clock. Almost morning. Mrs. Halbrook nods. Then the line will close itself. The tall man stands slowly. Do we speak? No, she says. Not yet. He sits back down. The sound of his chair settling fills the silence for a moment, then fades. The light grows stronger, enough to draw faint colour back into the room. The dull brown of the wooden table, the grey of the curtains, the pale sheen of the silver bell. The world begins to reappear. Mrs. Halbrook's eyes remain closed. They leave with the dark, she says, and the dark leaves with them. But what we've opened stays open in another way. The living will find it in their dreams, in the corner of their thoughts when the night grows still again. The tall man nods. and we are not to fear it. Not fear, she says. Respect. The widower lifts the folded paper from his coat and sets it gently on the table. The chalk dust clings faintly to its surface, the traces of the night already settling upon it. He looks at it for a long time, then speaks. He is gone, he says, but I am still his father. Mrs. Halbrook's voice is soft. That is how it should be. The maid crosses the room to the window and lifts one corner of the curtain, just enough to let the first true light in. It is pale, weak, uncertain, but it carries colour where none has been all night. The glow touches the table, the chalk, the slate, the folded paper. The candle gutters once, twice, then dies. The small thread of smoke rises in a single line before fading into the air. No one moves. Mrs. Halbrook opens her eyes. That is the end, she says quietly. Not the finish. The end. The tall man lets out a slow breath. And now, she says, we remember what we are. He nods once, as though that instruction alone is enough to carry him back into the day. The widower folds the letter again, careful, reverent. The maid lets the curtain fall. The room dims slightly, but not with shadow, only the lingering grey of early morning. The clock chimes the hour. The sound fills the parlour evenly, a clean, steady tone that belongs entirely to the living world. No one speaks afterward. The house has found its rest. The walls, once alive with whispers, now seem only what they are: wood, plaster, paper, and time. The scent of smoke and salt lingers faintly, a trace of what the night held. Mrs. Halbrook rises first. The movement is slow, deliberate. She takes the bell from the table, holds it for a moment in her hand, and then sets it back in its place on the mantel. She smooths the front of her dress, not from vanity, but habit. The tall man stands next, his movements stiff from long sitting. He straightens his coat, runs a hand through his hair, and glances once more at the table before stepping back. The widower lingers. His eyes are on the folded page, but he does not reach for it this time. He leaves it where it lies. The maid opens the door. The first pale strand of daylight falls through, carrying with it the faint, cold breath of the waking city. Somewhere outside, the sound of footsteps begins. A milkman, perhaps, or someone bound for work. Life resumes its pattern without apology. Inside, the parlour holds its silence, warm now, empty, but not hollow. The ritual is over. The night has closed its circle. Mrs. Halbrook stands beside the table for one last moment, her eyes on the faint word still visible on the slate. Wait. She touches it lightly with the edge of her finger, smudging it until it disappears. Then she turns toward the door, and the others follow. No one speaks. The dawn has its own language, and it requires no words. The house, left behind, breathes once more into its stillness. The salt remains where it was laid. The ashes in the hearth settle. The air holds the last traces of smoke and sage and wax. The watchers are gone. The dead are silent. And the living have remembered how to listen. And somewhere in the quiet that follows, beyond hearing, the night itself exhales. The house stands in its own hush, every sound softened by the pale drift of the hour before morning fully arrives. The air is cool, no longer heavy with night, but still touched by the residue of what passed. The faint smell of wax lingers, a thin trace that clings to the wood and the curtain fabric. The last candle, the one by the mantel, has burned almost to its base. Its light wavers close to the brass, making the metal glow as if from within. It will not last long, but no one moves to replace it. The tall man sits again, though he does not remember deciding to. The chair creaks lightly beneath him, the sound smaller now that the house has resumed its normal breathing. The widower stands by the window, the curtain drawn aside just enough to let the faint grey light of dawn filter through. The maid has gone to the kitchen but left the door open, the quiet clatter of dishes coming faintly from beyond, small, ordinary sounds that feel foreign after the night's long stillness. Mrs. Halbrook remains seated at the table, her hands folded, her eyes not on the dying candle, but on the empty slate before her. The chalk dust lies scattered across its surface, dull and grey. Nothing has moved since the last word faded, and nothing will. She reaches out slowly and brushes the dust with her fingertips, gathering it into a faint line. The motion is absent of purpose, something done not for meaning but for rhythm. A small repetition to fill the quiet. The powder clings to her skin, faintly white against the darker tone of her hand. She studies it as if the residue itself carries memory. The tall man watches her. "You look as if you've done this 1,000 times, he says, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have," she answers. "It changes nothing. That's the comfort of it." He nods faintly. "There's comfort in repetition. There's survival in it," she says. "That's what people forget." The widower closes the curtain again. The window fogs faintly from the warmth of his breath against the glass. The outside world has colour now, dull but visible. The line of rooftops, the faint movement of chimney smoke, the grey stretch of cobblestones still damp from mist. The city is beginning to wake, cautious and slow. He turns back to the room. "It feels smaller now," he says quietly. "The house." "It always does after," Mrs. Halbrook replies. "The walls remember how close they've been to vanishing. They draw tighter for a while." The tall man leans forward, elbows on his knees. "And you? Do you draw tighter too?" She glances at him, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "No, I let the morning do the work. It knows how to put things back where they belong." He smiles faintly, though not from amusement. "I think I envy that." "Then you're already learning," she says. The faint clatter from the kitchen grows softer, replaced by the sound of running water. The maid returns carrying a basin and a cloth. She sets them quietly on the sideboard and glances toward the table. "Would you like the candle snuffed?" she asks. Mrs. Halbrook shakes her head. "Not yet." The maid nods once and begins to wipe the edges of the sideboard, each stroke precise, practiced. The faint scent of soap mingles with the wax and ash. The air feels cleaner already, though it has not changed in temperature. The tall man looks toward the hearth. The embers have nearly died, their glow faint but persistent beneath a thin layer of grey. "It's strange," he says. "After everything, it feels almost ordinary again." "It is," Mrs. Halbrook says. "It always was. The extraordinary doesn't erase the ordinary. It just makes us notice it for a while." The widower moves toward the table and rests his hand on its surface, near the spot where the chalk once moved. "Then what happens now?" "Now," she says, "the house becomes a house again. We open the door, we let in the day, and we don't speak of it until the night asks for us again." He nods, though his gaze remains fixed on the empty slate. "And if it does?" "It always does," she says. The maid finishes wiping the sideboard and folds the cloth neatly. "Do you want the salt swept up?" she asks. Mrs. Halbrook looks toward her. "Leave it. The house will decide when it's ready to be bare again." The maid sets the cloth aside and folds her hands. The tall man watches the exchange with quiet interest, his analytical habit returning by degrees. "You trust the house," he says. "I trust habit," she answers. "It keeps us from imagining too much." The light in the room grows stronger. It flattens the shadows, dulls the gleam of the brass bell, turns the air from grey to pale blue. The candle burns shorter, its pool of wax widening until the flame seems to rest on the edge of collapse. The widower lowers himself into the chair beside Mrs. Halbrook. "Last night, when the message came," he begins, his voice low, "I thought I would want proof. Something solid, something to hold. Now that it's morning, I think I understand that it wasn't for that." She nods. "The dead don't give proof. They give permission." "For what?" "To live," she says. He sits back, silent. The tall man glances between them but says nothing. The maid looks away, her expression unreadable. The candle's flame flickers violently once, then steadies. A bead of wax slides down the side, catching the light before falling soundlessly to the mantel. The air in the room cools further as the heat wanes. Mrs. Halbrook rises slowly, crossing the short distance to the window. She draws the curtain back again, letting the full light spill into the room. It is not bright, not yet, but it is enough to show the dull gleam of morning on glass and brass and the faint pattern of the rug. The world outside looks washed clean, quiet, unassuming. She stands for a moment, watching the pale street. Then she turns and faces the others. "When the candle burns low," she says, "that's when they step back fully. They don't vanish, they simply lose their shape. The air forgets them. The house exhales, and then it is ours again." The tall man looks at the candle. "And if it burns out?" "Then we light another," she says. "That's all the living ever do." He nods slowly, his eyes tracing the thin thread of smoke already rising from the wick as it sputters. "I suppose that's faith of a kind." "It's practice," she corrects him. "Faith is too heavy to carry every day." The maid moves to the table and begins to collect what remains: the unburned candle stubs, the empty tin, the folded cloth. She does it silently, efficiently, as though restoring the room to its proper order erases the night's weight. The widower stands, adjusts his coat, and looks once more at the slate. "You'll keep it?" he asks. "For a while," Mrs. Halbrook says, "until it forgets." He nods. "And us?" "You'll forget too. Not all at once, just enough to live." The tall man rises, slipping his notebook into his coat pocket. He has not written a word all night, but the gesture comforts him. "I'll walk with you part way," he says to the widower. They both look to Mrs. Halbrook. She gives a small nod, neither approval nor dismissal. "The street will be clear now," she says. The maid opens the door again. The cool morning air enters, carrying with it the sound of distant footsteps and the faint rumble of a cart on the cobblestones. The world has resumed its usual rhythm. The widower steps through first, pausing only once to look back at the room. The tall man follows. Their footsteps echo softly in the hallway, growing fainter as they descend the stairs. Mrs. Halbrook remains where she is, her hand resting lightly on the back of the chair nearest the table. The maid looks at her, but does not speak. The candle burns lower still, the last fragment of its wick glowing red before sinking into the wax. The flame trembles, bends, and finally disappears, leaving behind a single thin thread of smoke. Neither woman moves for a long moment. The house settles again, its walls making that small, familiar sound of wood cooling after long warmth. Then Mrs. Halbrook turns to the maid. "Open the window," she says. The maid crosses the room and unclasps the latch. The pane shifts outward with a faint groan. letting the cold air in. It moves through the room gently, carrying the faint scent of morning fog and damp stone. The smoke from the extinguished candle drifts toward it and fades into the air outside. The light, now fully risen, fills the parlor with a pale grey that flattens every surface. The table is bare again. The salt at the corners glints faintly like frost. The slate lies untouched, its message erased, its dust settled. Mrs. Halbrook walks to the mantel, touches the brass holder once, and then lets her hand fall. She looks around the room, her gaze travelling across the walls, the floor, the empty chairs. The house feels smaller again, but safe. She turns toward the door. "Close it," she says quietly. The maid does. The latch clicks. The window remains open, the air clean and cold, and in the corner where the candle burned, a faint thread of warmth lingers still, invisible but real, the last remnant of light holding its place a little longer than it should, as if unwilling to forget the night that had just passed. The fog outside continues to lift. The city, grey and waking, moves on. The watchers have gone. The rooms belong to the living again. The candle is gone, but its memory stays, low, steady, waiting to be lit once more when the dark returns.